And we are live. Hi, everyone. It's Dark Journalist. It's great to have you here, and it's a big crowd. And this is going to be a terrific night because we're going to go over the amazing, just this incredible announcement about this story that we did in the video that came out. And, it's amazing because when the video came out, this was the video that's about Nixon's ET time capsule. And it's all about my interview with former insider Robert Merritt. Now we're going to go into Merritt's story tonight in more details, and we're going to go into the National Archives aspect of recovering the time capsule. And we're going to go into the story about how it got in there in the first place, and also Nixon's background with the UFO file, which is extensive, and how that plays into all this. I'm here with Alexandra Bruce from Forbidden Knowledge TV.
Hello.
It's great to see you.
Great to see you.
I know that you're juggling so many projects in the past 48 hours, so thank you very much for being here. And it's one of those things where, the story is so large that the contours of it will only come out, say, over the next ongoing weeks. But it's really a truly amazing story of this person who had these meetings with President Nixon that have never been on the record. And, they don't exist in history until his recent confession about them. And what he was trying to do, in my opinion, after many hours of conversation with him, was deal with the fact that he had a major health issue and that he needed this information to come out, and that those meetings were destined to come out one way or another. As a matter of fact, he even said that he felt that President Nixon was in favor of him coming out and discussing the fact that he had these 3 meetings. And we're going to go through those meetings and the implications of those meetings and the background with Nixon. One of the things I want to establish up front is that in the time capsule that was hidden at the White House that we referred to in the video, and I provided a link to the investigative video that has the exclusive interview with Robert Merritt. It's in the comments. It's in the description for this episode. The reason that time capsule is important, it would be important in any case, but it's specifically important because information relating to Nixon's experience with the UFO file and an ET and Los Alamos is in there. And this is something that Nixon felt would make him an incredible president in history, which was what was being stolen away from him at that very moment in 1972 when the Watergate case broke against him. And of course, over the years, we found out that Nixon was not so popular with the CIA or with military intelligence. He certainly was another president that ran into trouble with the deep state. Now, one of the things I think is interesting, though, is that Nixon always played a game. He was always one step ahead. He actually was known as a very excellent poker player. They say that playing poker helped him get through law school. And this, to me, is an extreme game of poker that he played. And what's particularly important about it is when I think of him setting up the Huston plan, which is a very important part of this, and remember, very little is known about the Huston plan as it stands. The Huston plan is something that Tom Huston, who was an assistant to the president, came up with. Tom Huston has a pretty extensive background going back to the Young Americans for Freedom, highly, right-wing conservative types of organizations that he was a part of. And he became a member of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And he came up with this plan with Nixon, who was really under siege at the time with the anti-war demonstrations. Nixon had decided to go forward with the Vietnam War and have peace with honor and that kind of approach. And what he got was a massive resistance against it. Now, Nixon, it should be noted here, didn't start the Vietnam War. As a matter of fact, as early as 1945, there were Americans in Vietnam of a military variety, but active boots on the ground, of course, came about through LBJ. And Nixon inherited that war, saying he had a secret plan for peace. And he assigned a new role that didn't exist before, which was Henry Kissinger's role. And of course, Kissinger plays a major part in this also. Were you coming in there, Alexandra?
Yeah, well, I just, it's an incredible story. And of course, I want to know where it is, and I want to know what's inside.
Yes.
That's
Yeah,
really what
Well, you make the great points, and I should stress here that I'm going to go in detail over the letter I have here to the National Archives and the updated communication that I have here. And I'm going to go through these points, which, of course, that end of it is being handled by Douglas Caddy, who viewers of Dark Journalists will be familiar with, because he came forward and gave us some amazing revelations relating to E. Howard Hunt, who he was his best friend and also his lawyer. But E. Howard Hunt, of course, was a CIA super spy and played a great role in the JFK assassination. And there's a lot of information to that. But instead of looking at that so much, one of the things I found particularly interesting about Caddy is that when he came forward, the thing that he told me was that when he had met for the last time with Hunt, before Hunt went to prison, that Hunt told him that JFK was assassinated because he was about to share a most vital national secret. And the secret was the alien presence. Now, that was 1975. And this is, him hearkening back to this. So this was in there in the intelligence grid, this idea that Kennedy had the UFO file and was getting close to it. And again, in the Watergate situation, we have Nixon getting very close to that UFO file also. And that's what I want to really draw these parallels. And we will get to that. But what I want to say here about Caddy is handling this aspect of it, which is he's approached the National Archives. And I'm going to read the full letter later. But in that letter, he states that Merritt will provide directions to that time capsule under the conditions that it be read immediately to the public. And I think that's important because he wants it to be known that the National Archives can have the document. That's particularly significant. And it can be their property, but they need to read it and distribute it to the public. And what's in there is so earth-shattering that it's going to be very difficult to get them to agree to that right off the bat. Of course, no one knows exactly what's in it except for Robert Merritt. But he's given us some idea, and you can find out from the video that I put out about it yesterday. Now, I think at this point, what I want to do is say that the process that's going on with Caddy in the National Archives is fascinating because there's a conversation now that's going on where these conditions, if they're met out, the chief archivist would set up a meeting with the White House and he would be given instructions for where the capsule was. And the chief archivist and representatives at the White House and representatives of Caddies would go forward and would meet with their counterparts, and they would go open the capsule, not in a very media frenzy manner, but they'd go open it, and the documents inside would be photocopied and given to all members of the press and read out to the public aloud. Now, there are factors, and there's so many different ways that this could play out, but I do feel it's significant at this point. The dialogue is happening. And one of the things I think is important from my interview with Merritt, which was pretty substantial and pretty wide-ranging, and we talked for hours, and I reframed the questions a number of times and got very consistent answers from Merritt. But one of the things that he put forward was that when I asked him, is the time capsule still there? His answer was absolutely, that he felt that it was still there. And the reason is it's kind of hidden in plain sight, and we have to sort of imagine Nixon being very clever about these types of things, wanting this role in history as disclosing this aspect of it, which he was very active on. Remember, in 1958 now, there's a whistleblower who came forward in the 90s, and we saw him even as recently as the Citizens hearing of disclosure. And he's talked to Linda Moulton Howe for 15 years. And he said that when he was in the CIA working the alien project at Los Alamos, and, he was feeding the reports directly to Vice President Nixon. And Vice President Nixon was in charge of something called CIA Blue Book, which was the real Blue Book, where we got Project Blue Book, which was a bunch of fluff, as even J. Allen Hynek, who was the main scientist part of it, said later it was a bunch of fluff. So I think that's pretty significant. But we did, we learned a lot even from the fluff exercise, which is that this was important enough and the Air Force had spent all this time and money putting it together. So it's pretty significant. But the first thing I want people to understand when we get into Merritt's background is that Merritt was a major player as an FBI informant, gave information to the ATF, as he said, and the Metropolitan Police Department in D.C., their intelligence unit. His background has been laid out in books like Jim Hogan's book, fantastic book called Secret Agenda, on the Watergate mystery. And he really goes deep. But I think that's 1984. That's the first portion where Merritt shows up in a book relating to Watergate. I've found some very interesting documents. This is from 1977, February 23rd, and it's they're commenting on the fact that this gay informant came forward and gave all this information. This is Merritt in that article. Let's see if we can get a shot of this. That's him there. And the article goes on to say that he was basically the ultimate insider who was giving the FBI intimate details about these different dissident groups. And, you know, this is more of that. But that is something in the Advocate that somebody can go back and check the files on to get a fuller picture of what Merritt's, you know, kind of public disclosures were in 1977.
Well, so
that's already
the Advocate. That's interesting. That's a good way to release it, actually.
Yeah, well, considering, yes, absolutely. And
that's sort of, you know, that's uncomfortable and weird about it is that he was basically like a deep state gay prostitute who was blackmailing people.
There's no question about it. Yeah, his role, as he states in the interview, was what they would have him do was lure these congressmen and senators into these compromising situations, film it, and then blackmail those people and other officials. And this was the job. And when I asked him what his role was, he said basically they used him as a robot male prostitute. And that immediately made me think of the Kathy O'Brien story. There are a lot of aspects actually that spill over from Kathy O'Brien's book. And so I find the parallels very fascinating in that regard. But you and I both know the Kathy O'Brien story. And Kathy O'Brien, there was a large sex aspect going on with that case as well.
Well, her story was completely crazy. Her father was a major child pornographer. He was using several of his children in animal child sex films. It was just abhorrent, just absolutely insane. And basically, he got busted. And rather than throw him in jail for the rest of his life, which is where he belonged, they realized that they had assets in the children, and finally it was whittled down just to her. I'm sorry, I got an echo. That they know what happens to the mind of a young child, a toddler like her, where this is your father, making you, have sex with dogs and donkeys and crazy, or goats, or what I think a goat was one. And, I mean, just absolutely the worst possible thing you can imagine. So basically, they knew that her mind was shattered and that she would be useful in their MK Ultra project that they were doing at that time. And it was Gerald Ford who was then brought in. She went through some grooming at the hands, incredibly bad abuse at the hands of the laity, the Catholic Church, where she lives in Muskegon, Michigan, and just horribly abused throughout her childhood. I guess more taken out so much from her dad and more into the hands of the Catholic Church, who I guess were trained in doing specific things to shatter her personality. And then eventually she was brought into different areas. I know that Tigger Air Force Base in Oklahoma was one, and a lot of them were Air Force bases all over the country where she would be taken for specific kinds of programming.
Yeah, it's fascinating. She
was an extreme. She was the highest level of fractured personality and control files probably ever of anyone ever in history.
Well, this is the signature of the deep state, which is they will use these techniques, a kind of sexual blackmail. They certainly tried sexual blackmail under J. Edgar Hoover with control files. They tried to blackmail JFK. and a whole host of senators. That's on record. We know that this went on. Kathy O'Brien's story goes a little further even still, though, in that they fractured her personality so much that she developed dissociative identity disorder and DID. And these different personalities would do different jobs and not talk to each other, because if they were the main personality and they remembered the things that they had done, then they wouldn't be able to live with themselves. And so she wouldn't be able to live with herself. So it's kind of fascinating, I think, that whole
that was the acid, is that she would never spill state secrets either, because she was unaware of those parts of her personality that knew those secrets. That was the whole point. And also just to do things that were unimaginable, and also to function as like a human recording device. Like she had photographic and memory, and also it was like a microphone. She could just remember every single thing, and that's how, when she was healing, how she was able to write what became that book, Transformation of America, which is a classic. It's an amazing book. I mean, it's hardcore, it's crazy, but what it is, it actually, so much of what we've since learned about, clandestine operations are in that book, and future sort of globalist agendas are all there spelled out. And this first one, I think, came out in 1995. So it's been a while, it's been out for quite a while. And it's an amazing read. But it was not a book originally. It was a court case for her to get her daughter back, who they had also brought into the project and dissociated. And the daughter was in a mental hospital, being fragmented in different ways. It was a little less traumatic based by the time of her daughter's generation. I think her daughter would be in her 20s now. Late 20s, and or maybe even early 30s. And so, and I'm not sure what the status is on her daughter. I know that you interviewed her, Kathy, a couple of years ago. But
yeah, it's still a difficult situation for her, as I understand. And her husband, Mark Phillips, passed away, of course, in the fall, and so I think that makes things very difficult for her. But the things that she's put on the record, I agree with you that it's been so important, the work that she's done, and really given us an idea of how that deep state operates when you're dealing with these individuals who become couriers, liaisons, sexual blackmailers, runners. That world is very little understood, because no one could imagine in a million years.
Also, it explains Pizzagate a little bit. That might be what's happening to some of these Pizzagate victims. They're being turned into things like Kathy O'Brien became.
I absolutely agree. Yeah. And so when we talk now about Merritt, and we're going into his revelations, one of the first things that happened to him was that he was the victim of rape by two Catholic priests in West Virginia, which basically went on. And so it drove him to leave West Virginia, and he ended up in Washington, D.C. One of the things he told me was that when he left West Virginia, he got on the Freedom Train, which Martin Luther King and all those people who were civil rights workers were a part of. So he really was there in the kind of an interesting slice of history. And when he got to D.C., he established himself. He just worked regular jobs. At one point, he worked at the National Institute of Health, and he was, assisting them in autopsies and things like that. So he developed a relationship with a neighbor, someone named Boris, who I found out was a Soviet attaché. And what looks like happenstance, but it is very odd, which is that they were photographing him and this relationship of him meeting with Boris and going places and having breakfast. And, I asked him about the status of that relationship, and he said, we were just friends, we hung out. So they took these pictures, and the FBI and the CIA individually, not at the same time, came to him with pictures and said, this is what we're going to do. We are going to tell you about what's going on, and are you a part of this? And, and getting into this whole kind of Red Scare type tactic with him. And this is his first introduction into that world of, the undercover people. But they figured out that they could use him, and that is where he really gets that entree into that world. What happens eventually is that from doing some work for them, he runs across Carl Schaffler, who spots him in these reports and shows up and decides that what they need, and there's actual great paper trail for this, which is that during Watergate and before, there was an intense focus on college campuses. Of course, they had the Kent State shooting in the 70s. The heart of the peace movement was on the campuses. So what they needed were young faces to go in there and make this happen. And somebody in 1970, like Merritt, who's basically 20 years old, he was the perfect candidate. You've seen the pictures of him in the documentary. He was an affable, good-looking guy, and he could fit in with these younger groups. And Schaffler is well known to history buffs because Schaffler is the man who arrested the Watergate burglars in 1972. He just happened to be there. It wasn't even his work night. So there's something very interesting, and anyone who's looked into Watergate realizes this was no ordinary guy on the police force in 1972. This is someone who's a really deep operator. And the things that Merritt told me about him is that he was not only working with the FBI and the CIA and some of these other groups, he was out of military intelligence. So, he had been through in a unit, and, so he was groomed in that role. So his job in the police force was sort of a cover job, so people wouldn't ask him too many questions, but he was a major liaison to these intelligence agencies. And that's where, Merritt really got groomed working with Schaffler. So Schaffler, historically, there's a point historically that we can, unlike a lot of people who come out with whistleblower stories, the paper trail around Merritt is incredible. And we're going to be able to watch him right through history. I should mention here that Merritt was featured also in the New York Times. And, we have the statement by Michael Powell, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist from the New York Times. And of course, I sent that to you. And his statement is that, I've always found in working, and that they've worked on stories over the past few years that don't deal with the alien subject. Don't get me wrong, it's strictly politics, and some of his work for the FBI as an informant, etc. But he said he found them completely reliable. And that's important because in that position, he needs to get the story right, just like I need to get the story right. And I spent a lot of time figuring out the background on this. Now, what's fascinating is there was a first attempt, really, for Merritt to come forward in 2011. And there was a book that came out, which was Merritt telling his story to Douglas Caddy. And TrimeBay released it, called Watergate Exposed, but it had tremendous problems of distribution. The publicists around it, there was a big kerfuffle between the people who were involved with it, and it sank like a rock out of sight because it just never made it. But people who were on the inside, like Jim Hogan, who really knew the subject, did reviews of the book, and those are still available. And of course, I have a copy of the book here. But I think it's significant because that book, when it came out, told some of these facts about Schaffler and how Watergate came about. Now, interestingly enough, after the book came out, Merritt said that only about 15%, 10 to 15% of what he knew was in that book. So that created a mystery again. And he faded from view after that, because it was an unhappy experience of trying to get the word out. He's told me over the years that there have been attempts to silence him and really keep him under wraps, especially during that 70s period. There's a quote in the big Advocate article on him in 1977, which talks about the FBI, the people he was dealing with. And they said, if you know what's good for you, basically slink back to West Virginia because there's going to be no future for you. And basically, you're going to find yourself as a target if you stick around. So they really silenced him at that point. And
you had mentioned that he had testified at the Senate, the Watergate hearings, but that his testimony had been trashed, or
it's a long story, but basically they knew that he was an important player because he showed up. Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor, had him questioned because they knew he had so much information. And what's interesting is right after that conversation, Cox was fired by Nixon. And there's been some thought that maybe, oh my God, if the secrets about Schaeffler came out through Merritt and all that, that they really have to get rid of that whole part of the Archibald Cox story. But before we go too far into that, what I want to do is jump back to the Huston plan. The Huston plan is another place on record that we can find where Merritt shows up. And this is very important because the Huston plan is really one of the darkest intelligence efforts inside the White House. And its sole purpose was to get the enemies of the White House and, open their mail, break into their place, get the goods on them, and blackmail them and silence them, because it was really a war between this military arm and the protesters and the peace activists and all these different groups. And if you really go back, I've spoken to Professor Peter Dale Scott, who's done some amazing books on this period. And he said, you really have to think of it like a civil war. And it's hard for us to think about that now, going back 45 years. And you get aspects of it now, but back then it was very much in your face. You had a large peace movement that was against the war, burning the draft cards, etc. And you had an administration that was completely dedicated to doing it their way. And you had the military-industrial complex really forcing themselves on the public. And it was an incredible clash. So inside the White House, what they decided to do, there were already aspects with the CIA and the NSA that were doing illegal surveillance of protesters. But Nixon decided, he had done things like trying to get records out of CIA Director Richard Helms, and it hadn't gone so well. And Helms, in fact, tried to hold certain things over him, that he created groups like Operation 40, who went into Cuba, and their objective was to assassinate Castro in 1960. And this was all hanging around Nixon's neck. So he wanted to get those records back, and he did a number of maneuvers to try to get Helms to do it. He eventually got rid of Helms, actually, and made him ambassador to Iran. That was just a simple solution. But he decided, this isn't going to work. I can't work through the traditional intelligence agencies, although he had representatives from all of them, including the CIA, the NSA, and the FBI. And of course, he went in with J. Edgar Hoover at the time and said, this is what I want to do. I want to do this kind of internal intelligence unit. And they really raised some eyebrows at him. But apparently he went forward with it on his own. So the Huston plan, no one really knows about it. The only thing that we know for sure is that there are 31 pages that are locked up that John Dean took with him and gave to Judge Sirica, and they locked them up in the case. The Church Committee in 1975 did hearings with Huston, trying to get those records and trying to get Huston to tell us what it was all about. And Huston said, well, there were illegal things in there. They were opening mail. They were doing break-ins, but we were under siege. This was all done under national security. And he denied that anything beyond the normal level of espionage was going on. What was interesting is espionage against American citizens, which is completely illegal. But that's another story. The thing about Huston I find interesting is, again, coming out of Defense Intelligence, the DIA, he is somebody who contributes to this military intelligence atmosphere that would eventually take, along with Alexander Haig, which would eventually take the Nixon presidency out. The way it reads in history isn't like that. We understand that Nixon did things to cover up a break-in, and that's what brought him down. But these things were orchestrated, and that's the heart of the Merritt story. That's why he's such a figure, because it's Schaeffler who was using Merritt as an informant and sending him in and getting him to blackmail people and all the rest. And Schaeffler is the arresting officer of the Watergate burglars. Now, here's the thing. How did Schaeffler know they were going to be there? And that's where the Merritt story unfolds. Now, we're dealing with an aspect where Merritt meets Nixon in a subterranean basement deep beneath the White House. And that when he goes into these meetings, he walks into this elevator that is very small, fit for about 3 people, with an agent who shows up at his place maybe 1 o'clock in the morning and just says, you're coming to the White House. And they take him and they bring him into this basement, and he has these meetings with Nixon. The first meeting is in early May, and it's right after J. Edgar Hoover dies. And that meeting is kind of like I want to congratulate you for all the work you've done. And if you look at the FBI FOIA documents relating to Merritt, his superiors would say that he did incredible work. So, it's a matter of record that he was used really over the course of 3 decades. I mean, specifically in this period, but he was used as an informant over this period of time. And of course, that whole Huston plan thing was at the core of why Nixon wanted to have these meetings with him, because he was recruited to be the main player of the Huston plan. He was going to be the guy that Nixon didn't have to deal with the CIA, didn't have to deal with the DIA, he didn't have to deal with the NSA. He'd have his own intelligence team. And we know he set up his own team called the Plumbers, who were there to plug leaks. And that's where we got Howard Hunt and all the rest of it. Well, we have to put some of the pieces together, and some of the puzzle pieces are, you've got Douglas Caddy over here, who is best friends with E. Howard Hunt, who was the CIA super spy. Hunt was in the Plumbers. He was one of the main Plumbers. He was the guy who was coordinating these people to do these jobs, which was an internal intelligence agency for the president. That is the root of the Watergate debacle, because these guys were caught going into the DNC supposedly to fetch information on prostitution. I found out, of course, in conversations that with Caddy, that Hunt had said there was a Cuban intelligence report there relating to Nixon's role in the setting up the JFK, this group that went in to assassinate Castro, and that group somehow was the same group that killed Kennedy, and that they wanted that information. So, okay, so we start to understand the players that we're looking at. Hunt contacts Caddy on the morning of the Watergate burglary, and he says, you've got to show up and you have to represent these burglars that were just caught, who are all CIA contract agents. And Hunt and Liddy weren't originally identified as being part of the break-in. That came later. So, but immediately it came out that Caddy is there. And so if you watch All the President's Men and they go in and they have that scene, you will see Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein go in and they see this lawyer representing these burglars, and they say, who sent you over here? Who did this? And he doesn't say anything. That's Douglas Caddy. And Caddy has a unique role here because he was sort of set up to represent these guys, and he got pulled into it. And at one point, they even try to put him in jail for not giving information and not testifying against his own clients, which is, you wouldn't think that someone would have to testify against their own clients. So it's a fascinating story, that aspect of it. Now, let's go to the Merritt Schaffler side of it. Merritt is Schaffler's informant. Schaffler is his handler. He sends him on different jobs, etc. So when Schaffler grabs the burglars, it's always been a great mystery. How did he know? And one of the things that Merritt has told us on the record about this is that he knew someone named Rita Reed, who was a switchboard operator at a very large apartment complex in DC, and that she overheard a conversation which led her to believe that there was going to be a break-in a couple of days later. And apparently she heard some intelligence officials talking about that this was going to happen. And what happened was Rita Reed said to Merritt, don't tell Schaffler whatever you do, because he's the absolute worst. But this thing is going to be big. But he did. Merritt did, in fact, tell Schaffler, and then Rita Reed disappeared. And then when Merritt went to check her apartment a day later, because he was going to meet her for dinner, she was gone and her apartment was cleared out. And the landlord said, oh, there was never anyone named Rita Reed here. So they got rid of her. They just disposed of her. But the information that Merritt got from Reed, who was listening on the switchboard conversation that she had plugged into, and something caught her attention and she continued to listen. She gave that information to Merritt, and Merritt gave the information to Schaffler, who knew when the break-in was going to occur, and he was able to bag them as a result of that. And there were so many deep state factions going on there. What Merritt told me is that there were 5 different agencies involved in the break-in. So, FBI, NSA, CIA, and more. So this is this whole cloud that we're talking about.
because now when Merritt speaks, he's got such an allegiance to Nixon, but I guess it turns out that he's the one who sort of called the cops on him.
Yes, it is interesting, but here's the thing. Before, in the second meeting that he had with Nixon, he tried to tell Nixon about the Rita Reid situation. He tried to say, look, there is a break-in that's going to happen, and there is this stuff that's going on. But he said that Nixon said to him, yeah, well, I heard about, I know that there's another break-in going on, but it's okay. It's only going to be information that destroys the Democrats. Don't worry about it. And when he tried to press the point, Nixon was kind of like, I'm the president. Like, that's it. That's the end of the conversation. And in that second meeting, Nixon again was saying, I'm going to give you some new instructions. And he gave him two very interesting instructions. One of the instructions was to bomb the Institute for Policy Studies. These are instructions that were never followed through on because the break-in happened just a few days later. And the other instruction was to, in Merritt's words, was to kill a professor at American University who he did not get the name of at that point, and then eventually it was called off. But whatever was going on there, these are really, you think about the Huston plan, these are the types of tasks. I'm talking about the deepest, darkest intelligence unit that's out there. And Merritt's story is this was the task he was set up with. He did not do either of those, as it turned out, because it got called off. But so if we go now into the third meeting that he had with President Nixon, this is the one that's the most significant for our purposes because it gets into the UFO file, it gets into the presence of the knowledge that Nixon had about the ET presence, and it also gets us to the time capsule. So that really, when you go through the information, once you understand Watergate, once you understand Merritt, and there's a lot of historians, by the way, people like Jim Hogan, who have been dealing with the Merritt story since 1973. And so, no one can say this is some Johnny come lately. It's 45 years of public documented information about an individual.
A figure who appears in FOIA documents as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. And a good deal of them were released in 2008. Actually, the more we get into Merritt, when I've done my own investigations, I find document after document relating to him. Here is a this is from 1973. Okay, on the record. It's called The Daily Rag, which was kind of like a protest zine from Washington, D.C. And it says, FBI informant confesses. This was given to me by Douglas Caddy. And it's the disclosure. I'm going to read this briefly. And again, remember, it's 1973. And fast forward the year. Now we're 45 years later. And this is Merritt on the record in 1973. With the disclosure of Robert Merritt's role as an FBI and Metropolitan Police informer, the reality of police surveillance of active community groups and illegal police activities in the district is confirmed. Such groups as the DC Statehood Party, RAP, Common Cause, Off Our Backs, and the ACLU have been under surveillance. While the information Merritt provides on widespread police intelligence is substantial, it leaves open many questions as to what else is going on. For this reason, the open letter printed below. Okay, so there's a big open letter here to Evan Bayh, Senator Eagleton. Exactly how many community active groups have been under surveillance? What is the extent of record keeping of these groups? Now, this is before they had the internet and all that, and it's so easy to spy on this now, but back then it was quite a scandal. So this is on the record, 1973, Merritt identified as an FBI informant. We know whistleblowers. When whistleblowers come out, God love them. It's very hard to prove anything they have to say. Merritt has a documented track record that, we're kind of out in the UFO aspect. You'd have to play catch up, but the people who've done work around the JFK assassination, Watergate, they're all very familiar with Merritt because he's in that political milieu. And so the deep state aspect with him goes on for years and years. So in terms of when a whistleblower comes forward, we have some rules about establishing their bona fides. Where were they? And, who are they? Are they who they said they are? Were they where they said they were? And, we have a list of criteria about how to establish somebody. One of the big problems that we've had in alternative media is people coming along and saying things and having absolutely no trail and track record at all to go with. So we have a very unique situation here of somebody who was deep on the inside, and somebody who can tell us about the Huston plan. Now, the Huston plan, again, for the record, 31 pages under lock and key. We did a big special on the JFK files coming out after 53 years. Huston files didn't even make it that far, right? Here it is, 31 pages. The Huston plan files were locked up during the Watergate hearings. That's 1973. The Church Committee tried to get them. No dice. We should be able to see those documents to see exactly what they were up to. And I'm confident that those documents would identify Robert Merritt as one of the main players in the Huston plan. So, but I do think it's interesting that, going back to Nixon's mentality again, he has his own internal unit. He's got Hunt running these former anti-Castro Cubans to break into the DNC. Former CIA guys, they did the dirty jobs. They go back to the Bay of Pigs. This is a very thick, dense, deep state operators, covert operators, and some of the most hardcore guys. So Nixon is thinking, I don't need the CIA. They're giving me a big problem. The NSA and the FBI, they're all giving me a problem. The president should have the ability under these circumstances. He was thinking, I'm under siege. You know, there's a war in the country. And there's no doubt that the students, if you talk to some of those people now, we know it from talking to people, they hated Nixon. I mean, they did, and they probably had good reason for it at the time. But the fact is, that much acrimony that existed between the anti-war demonstrators and the Nixon administration, it was like a war, if you go back and look at it. And anyone who was there will certainly tell you that. And they used the dirtiest tricks to get rid of those people. And
makes one wonder why it didn't happen again during, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, you made a great point about that, which is what happened to the anti-war movement?
Yeah, where's the outrage? I mean, people want to have Trump derangement. I mean, the real derangement should be the fact that we're still in Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history, and that we keep on doing these covert actions. And
yeah, I mean, one thing we can say about the Vietnam War is it ended at some point. Can they end the war in Afghanistan? Is it ever going to happen? Yeah. Let's see. They sent guys in there in 2001, and so it's 17 years later. I believe it is the longest running war that we've ever had. But so we'll move into this. We understand the environment now. We understand Nixon. We understand the kind of pressure he was under, and we understand that he wanted to use these players, ex-CIA players, to form his own unit to go after these people, no fingerprints, etc. And it worked. It worked quite well. And the Huston plan is maybe the pivotal point, because the Huston plan is probably the greatest example of that. If the more information we get on the Huston plan, the better. Now, the way that Merritt described it, I think, is fascinating, which is that he would be taken into these situations where he would be beneath the this apartment building, and he'd show up there at 1 o'clock in the morning, and it would be a whole court in session, and he would have to swear to an affidavit so that they could do things and get warrants and do the surveillance stuff. And he was used in these strange late night court meetings. This is all part of the Huston plan. This is the kind of information that they needed, and you can see how useful he would be. He's an informant. You can tell him what to say, and boom. And Merritt is a guy from West Virginia. He's following orders, because he believes in country, and he's working directly with some big players in these clandestine agencies. I mean, you can see how this could happen to a young guy. And so then he winds up in these special meetings with the president beneath the White House. So it seems like Nixon either developed a bond with him, or there was some kind, there's something there, which is like, either Nixon was trying to cultivate him so that he could really gain his trust and send him on jobs that were kind of like as the personal intelligence emissary of the president. That's what it seemed like to me. But he certainly complimented him on his work, and he would talk to him about, hey, you're a great guy, and you do better than some of my best FBI guys. And I find that part of the interview that I had with Merritt fascinating, because over and over again, Merritt doesn't understand why Nixon read him aloud this third letter. So let's go into this third meeting. And here's what happened. The third meeting, as he described it to me, and is in the video interview that I did with him, is he gets taken, though. This is after Watergate has occurred. And he gets taken the same way. He's brought in by an agent deep under the White House. And it's early, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. And Nixon this time is a totally different figure. And he completely knows that he's been set up by the Watergate situation and the break-in that happened. And he realizes his presidency is over. So when he shows up, Nixon is actually behind a desk wiping away tears from his face. And Merritt comes in and doesn't know what to say, is freaked out as usual when he meets and talks with President Nixon. And Nixon goes into a number of things about why this is going to ruin his presidency, etc. And he said, I need you to deliver something. And it's a very important thing. And we have to remember that one of the key roles that Merritt played for these insiders is that he was a great courier. That is, he was somebody that a lot of the agency people you could get around, as opposed to using someone who's a regular aide to the president to go give something to Nixon that they could tail. Merritt really could operate in that netherworld. And he was assigned as a courier by Nixon in this case too. The idea was to get this letter to Henry Kissinger. Now, Nixon had developed a kind of a gloomy exterior because of the Watergate situation, but he got kind of excited or happy at one point when he was talking to Merritt, and he said, I'm going to read you a letter, which is my message to the American people. And in that letter, he talked about the fact that he had been part of a group that had managed this aspect, that we had an alien in our possession, and that we had over 20 years obtained incredible information from this communication. Now, we know the stories are out there relating to Nixon managing the UFO file in the 50s, especially when Eisenhower had a stroke, and then Nixon really stepped into the role and tried to be a liaison working with those military intelligence people and moving the UFO file into corporate hands so that it existed in this kind of corporate political netherworld where no one can get their hands on it, which is why when we go into the Kennedy administration, Kennedy says, give me those files in the UFO. And he has all these incredible difficulties culminating in his assassination, which is, we know, just 10 days before his assassination, he says, we're going to communicate and we're going to cooperate with the Soviets about the UFO issue. And he commands NASA to give him that information. So any attempts to get around that, these agencies and the deep state, I think, hold that as a sort of a sacred trust, that they're holding on to the UFO file. As Hunt told Caddy, Kennedy was about to give away our most vital national secret. And when Caddy said, what was it? He said, the alien presence. So that's how they regard it. It's like the atomic bomb or something for them. Now, when we look at this and we look at Nixon's position talking to Merritt about this, we have to consider all that history. Now, there's another thing which you and I are familiar with, which is the story that Nixon showed Jackie Gleason these aliens in storage in a Florida air base. You remember that one?
I remember it from, what was it, a tabloid, or
it was it's TV Guide. Yeah. But it's Jackie Gleason's ex-wife, and we know that Gleason and Nixon were very tight friends. And at a certain point, they escaped Secret Service and in disguise late at night, which, by the way, Nixon was known to do. There's a classic scene where there's a major protest going on, and all these hippies are sleeping at the Lincoln Memorial, and he shows up at 1 o'clock in the morning and talks to them all. I mean, This is the kind of thing that he did, and then his Secret Service people had to go and grab him. He definitely was spontaneous. Let's just put it that way. But the thing about this, I think that's important, is that Jackie Gleason's wife, and there's a lot of weird things about Jackie Gleason. Jackie Gleason wound up making a huge flying saucer out of his house after this experience. So let's keep that in mind. That's a fact, by the way. And the wife said, well, Gleason, who loved to eat, couldn't eat for 3 days, and that he described the aliens that he saw in storage as looking like children. So, but Nixon wanted to show off, in a sense, because he'd been managing this thing, and he's there with a big shot, and he says, I'm going to show you something. And he takes him to this air base, and he shows him the dead aliens. Now, here's what's interesting about all that. he's kind of doing something like that when he's dealing with Merritt, because he's reading him this letter aloud in the basement of the White House in their third and final meeting. And he says, we obtained this information. The scientists at Los Alamos obtained this information from working with this alien over 20 years. That they'd learned to communicate it, and that there's a formula. And he describes this in the interview. And if everyone wants any real detail on that, I suggest they go there and watch it. In the interview, he describes this formula. By the way, the letter is all in hand. It's in his own hand. So it's not a typewritten letter. It's handwritten. I think that's significant also, because when the time capsule gets brought up, instead of saying, well, this is some doctored document or whatever, if it's in his handwriting, it's going to be very hard to prove that it was anybody else. So I think that was part of his strategizing there. But he showed him something that looked like a strange scientific formula. It was in red ink, and it was very meticulously done. And he said, basically, this is what we got from the alien, and it has the potential for our planet to make it the greatest paradise, or it's completely devastating. And whoever has this information, and we do in the United States, will be the most powerful nation anywhere, because this information is so incredible. Now, what he says, when he's talking about this, is that you can't even imagine. And at a certain point, Merritt says, well, is it like Star Trek? Because Merritt doesn't know anything about UFOs and doesn't really care, frankly. And even when I talk to him now, aside from wanting to talk about the meetings with Nixon, he doesn't want to talk about UFOs. He's a very down-to-earth guy. He's very skeptical. As a matter of fact, he told me that when Nixon read him the letter and they had a conversation afterwards, that Merritt was almost skeptical of playing like a doubting Thomas about it. And that Nixon was like, don't worry, we know so many things now. And he said Star Trek was antiquated. So this was the power of that conversation. But what he said to him in the basement was that he'd hit a time capsule in the White House that would be discovered, and that it basically would not only show the world about the alien presence, it would show how Nixon had shepherded that presence, and how he had been one of the key people in doing that, and the amazing things that we had got from that collaboration. That disclosure that Nixon left behind, Nixon did it in such a way that it would not be detected until the time was right. This is the way Merritt explained to me. And it was something hiding in plain sight at the White House. Now, I think it's significant that this came up, because if somebody comes up with a story about a time capsule at the White House, it's one thing. But I think because it's Merritt, and because he had this long background of working around the whole period and the people involved with the Nixon administration, we have to take a very careful look at this, because the information that he's bringing forward in his situation, which, is a very dire health situation. And he really, as he explained it to me, the way they've explained it to him on the medical side, he doesn't have very much time to be with us. And he did tell me that he had profiled me, and that he felt that I would basically give his story an honest shake. And that's what I'm doing as I've got into his story, and I connect the dots between what Douglas Caddy told me. I have a better picture in order to be able to say this for what I put together for the video for everyone, which is that information that he wants out, that he's willing to give it to the National Archives, that he has, said you can take it, but the thing is, it has to be in the stipulation in the letter. It says you have to read it aloud, and it has to be part of the public record. It has to be distributed to the media. So this is what I think is very significant about the time capsule. The idea of a time capsule being in the White House, thinking about Nixon's personality, knowing that his enemies had taken him out. He may have even used it. This is something that I thought of, and it's not anything that Merritt said, but this is just me speculating. He may have used it as the ultimate insurance policy, not to be prosecuted, because he might have said, look, I've got this capsule. You guys will never get your hands on it. If you do that, boom, And of course, we know he was pardoned. And there have always been questions around that pardon, because, of course, President Ford doing the pardon, it's one of the weirdest pardons in history, by the way. We know Ford was pretty unusual anyway. Just look at the Kathy O'Brien story. But Ford really lost to Carter because he gave the pardon to Nixon, because they looked at it as a whitewash at the time. You know, if you can enter that, but you can enter that period in your mind, you know, everyone viewing. And Alexandra, you know, just thinking about the 70s in this period, the idea, if he had the alien information, I remember there's a quote from Roger Stone where he says, you know what, there has to be maybe this occasion where Nixon says to, and Roger Stone worked closely with Nixon also, and Roger Stone says, Nixon says to him, look, if they try to prosecute me, I'll take down Helms, I'll take down Ford, I'll take the whole group down. So they knew that he had something. Of course, he had secrets. He had set up, being the VP from 52 to 1960, he had been the main man working on all the CIA projects, including Mossadegh in Iran, you know, the incredible things we did in Guatemala, Arbenz. And so, you know, he was such a key point man. He knew everything. And if they were going to do this to him and then prosecute him, it was one thing to remove him, but if they were going to prosecute him after the fact, then he was going to bring out these secrets. I believe, and this is just my speculation at this point, I think the time capsule was part of that, because I think he wanted to be remembered as a great president. And if we start to look at some of his policies, now we're looking at Russia, now we're looking at the things he did with China. He opened up Russia and China. He created détente. He was the first president to go to China and open relations, and look at China's role in the world now. So, but what he was developing was a response to the UFO file, the alien information, because the whole world needed to be united around this whole thing in order to understand, hey, there's another group here. I think we can start to look at his foreign policy in this context, which is an important point.
And he had a significant foreign policy. So my question for you is, so Caddy has you contacted the National Archives? Have the National Archives acknowledged receipt?
The negotiations that are going on there, I have, let's start with this, which I've collected some excerpts from his letter, where he goes over the different meetings. But I think I'll come to the key point, which I read part of this in the video. He says, and this is Caddy representing the whole situation. I remember Caddy's a lawyer, and this is a legal document, a legal request to the National Archives, and it spells out who the archivist is that has received it. He says, we would like to request that you arrange an unpublicized appointment with the White House in the near future, at which time you or someone designated by you would meet with a small group of persons selected by Mr. Merritt and me, and all of us would then proceed to the location of President Nixon's secret document. The only condition that we impose, if the document is discovered, is that it immediately be read aloud to those present, and that copies of it be made and distributed immediately to the public media and to those present, after which the National Archives would take permanent possession of President Nixon's document. To assist you in making a decision on a request for an appointment with the White House, he suggests that he watches, I encourage you to watch the interview of Mr. Merritt conducted by Daniel Liszt, and he goes into the video and all the rest. Your attention to this letter is appreciated. Now, included with this is Pulitzer Prize winning reporter Michael Powell from the New York Times, and his quote, which was used here, and it says, and this is Powell's quote about Merritt and the work that they did together, not relating to the capsule or anything like that, just work that they did together on political stories for the New York Times, referring to Merritt, however, who was the main object of this. Quote, Michael Powell, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, New York Times. I am a New York Times columnist and writer, and I've worked on and off with Robert Merritt for many years. He can be excitable and passionate, but in my experience, he's also remarkably level-headed, and his work has benefited many federal and city investigations. He's worked on everything from city investigations to the Watergate and the undermining of a president. He now appears to be the victim of a concerted attempt to undermine his credibility, and it is taking a grievous and unfair toll on his health and safety. That's a very good point, which is that he's been in such a position, I think, as an informant, and he's such a deep player that when he comes out and says anything, he really does need to, he gets electronically harassed, and there are different intimidation things that are still in place to just keep silent, keep out of the picture. I think that they were in the 70s, they were actually threats against him. And with this, I think it's important that when a whistleblower like Merritt comes forward, they do it at great risk to themselves. But what I caught when I talked to Merritt was the sense of he knew, and this is the fascinating part, he knew that Nixon was going to want him to say this. And Nixon had never told him when. But it's interesting because Nixon used him as a kind of human time capsule. And I think that's what we need to grasp here as well. So we're in this situation where it's rolling out exactly as Nixon wanted, if you think about it, because he's going to be remembered, if this gets opened up, as the president who disclosed this important thing to the American people, which is gigantic in history, if you think about it. Now, Merritt, I think, just wants the truth out, and he wants to basically restore Nixon's image also, because he had a great relationship with him. He thought he was a great president. And Nixon also said, you might find the time to bring this out, and that when the time is right. And Merritt said, what do you mean? Like, when is the time going to be right? What if something happens to me? And at that point, Nixon said, well, listen, Kissinger, it will still be living. So, of course, we haven't gotten anything from Henry Kissinger.
Prophecy, because who knew that this, sort of tubby dude would still be alive. And how old is he now? 91.
94. He and G.W. Bush are leading the league. Obviously, they have the age extension technologies. But I do find it fascinating, yes.
Do you get any sort of clues as to where the goods are?
Well, the thing was, I understood that clearly that they're in the White House. That's for one. Two, that they're hidden in plain sight. And
so not on the floorboard or in the wall or anything like that. Because
what's interesting, someone sent me.
They could sweep for microphones. They could sweep for all kinds of things.
No question, but
how would this evade for 50 plus years?
The way I understand it is that Nixon, and the laugh that Merritt gives me on that tells me that Nixon was very clever about what he did in this case. And when I asked him, do you think the time capsule is still there? After all, it's 45 years later. And he said, yes, absolutely, it's there. So that was very clear, because, of course, you and I would think it would be gone, and it could have been retrieved, or so many things would have happened with it. But again, this is very important. If these meetings took place in that shadow of Watergate and they were throwing him out of office, the UFO file is the most important secret of the US government. There is no higher secret. He would know that he was the one who had the highest secret. He was the best official. He knew about it the longest time. The person who knew the most as a public official about the UFO file was Eisenhower, because he had gone through World War II and the setting up of the CIA and all the rest of it. He knew. This is his VP, man number two. And there's all the sightings in the 50s. There's Blue Book. There's all of these things that have happened. And
heard about Roosevelt's possible, involvement with UFO secrecy. Definitely Eisenhower. Never a peep. And JFK. Never a thing about Nixon being.
It's true.
So that's
true. I'll tell you what has come out about Nixon. There are whistleblowers. You remember this whistleblower, actually, because they rolled him out in the Citizens Hearing for Public Disclosure, which was a very important event that got bulldozed over. Because they had problems distributing it or whatever. But what was interesting was
a lot of downloads or live streams of that, actually, back in 2012, 2013.
Yeah, and we should mention this, that this was put together by Stephen Bassett. Mm-hmm. And that Bassett had a donor who said, look, if you can set up a congressional style, the way we ordinarily would in the government about UFOs, bring these issues up and, have the best people give testimony about it and hire these kind of retired Congress people to administer it the way they would in a congressional setting. And that's what they did. And for the most part, I think they did a really good job. Now, that event, though, there was
the Alaska congressman is amazing. What's Grindle?
Mike Gravel.
Gravel.
Yeah.
He said amazing, amazing.
Right. Well, it is interesting. I think if we get into that whole thing, which is we're in a situation where we have the possibility of getting the UFO information that Nixon put aside. I think there is this possibility, and it has to be dealt with carefully. And that's how I think they're dealing with it on the legal side with this. And I think Caddy writing the letter and giving them the opportunity to have the document and keep it. It's not even like, we're trying to say that the public should keep the document. The archives can have the document, but they have to distribute it. And that seems fair. Now, there's a number of conditions around that. Like they could say, well, it pertains to national security. We couldn't let it out. But there are other variables. Like they could say, yeah, we did find the letter. Here's the letter, and here's the part you can read, and here's the part you can't. And then that's
really the archives' job, really. That's the CIA's job.
Right. And I think, the archives would be the first one to go into it. And actually, in this case, I think it would be the State Department that would deal with it because he is the president after all, and it's the State Department that handles that. So you wouldn't have the intelligence in there, actually. They should not have a role in it at all.
These are not CIA documents. These are...
Exactly.
They're Project Houston or whatever.
They're the president's papers.
Yeah.
So, yeah, really. But you make a good point, which is let's think about this process for a moment. Okay.
Like legally, what's the next step for the archives now that they've been served, basically?
Yes. And this is it. And the complete letter I'm going to make available at darkjournalist.com. I have the letter. I've read it through. It has already gone to them. They've already had it for a few days. And they're sure ruminating on a response. But I do feel like there must be, on our side, some realization that we have information now relating to the UFO file, relating to maybe the entire story that we could get our hands on. And so it should be incumbent on people in that UFO community and the people who are concerned about this in the alternative media to come forward on this story and say, look, open the Nixon time capsule, at least look and see if it's there. This is somebody who was a part of that era. We have a very good track record of what he was. If somebody's taken the document, then fine. But with his confidence that it's still there and with his background for it and the fact that he had these 3 meetings with Nixon in the basement of the White House, then it could be very important to the public interest to get our hands on the document. And that should be, instead of chasing around after metal alloys or something, we have a real document that's sealed in a capsule, according to someone who's been a deep insider for over 4 decades with a demonstrable track record. And if these agencies used him, then chances are the things that he's telling us are the truth. So I do feel that this has to be looked at and gone after in such a way. Now, I think that we should wait and see what their response is. But in the meantime, this should be the story, and people really should, it was not easy for Merritt to do this. After speaking with Merritt, his health is really, really not good, but he spent the time, hours and hours, explaining the story to me. And I believe he's tried to bring out these truths. His truths in relation to Watergate were suppressed. Are they going to suppress his truths in relation to the alien presence? I mean, the researchers and the historians around Watergate understand the information that he brought forward, and they understand his relationship with Schaffler and all the rest of it. So, that's not debatable. It's not like
Merritt's letter does not give instructions for the location of this document.
And no, he will reveal the location.
Agree to the terms.
If they agree to read it publicly, yes. And I think it is important, because to just give it to them, well, that's nice, but there has to be some acknowledgement that Nixon put it in there and that it relates to the alien presence. Now, what's
I'm just,
interesting about this, yeah.
anybody knows anybody in the White House, we could just like cut to the chase and go get it.
Well, the only person that I've spoken to who works around that whole end of the spectrum is Roger Stone, and he does know Trump, and he would be a good person to do it. But I will say this, that there has to be maybe the understanding around this, which is, for once, we have the possibility, you know, without all the song and dance, without all the stuff about, will the government disclose or whatever, this is a very clear way. Nixon was under siege. According to one of the people who worked in the Huston plan for him directly when he was setting up this internal intelligence unit, he read this letter and he placed a copy of it in a time capsule in the White House. This person is willing to provide that information and has sent that acknowledgement to the National Archives. I think it's fair.
Was it idea to go to the National Archives, or was it Caddy's idea?
Well, they, you know, they've worked together. They, of course, when they, I'll tell you an interesting thing about Merritt. He was assigned to kill Caddy
Right.
back in 1972. So after the whole Watergate situation and Caddy had shown up as the Watergate lawyer, Schaffler and some of those people got together and said, look, you have to take out this guy. And then they raised the price at a certain point to $100,000. And again, just by luck, Merritt didn't wind up doing this assignment. And years later, Caddy became the person. But both of them were unconsciously aware of each other. Merritt was aware of Caddy because they had given him this instruction. And Caddy was aware because there were stories about Merritt and Schaffler and the whole thing about Watergate. So over the years, they make very strange bedfellows.
Did Merritt pop onto the radar? Watergate story.
Well, in '73, he was interrogated about that. He showed up, and this is in Watergate Exposed, his story of it, that what they did in order to disqualify his testimony was very interesting because obviously Merritt was gay at the time. By the way, later he wound up getting married and having 2 children and having a very different life from what he started off with here, which was in this kind of male prostitute role, getting blackmail information from these officials that they could use against these congressmen and stuff. And I would sort of call him, the kind of information that he was doing, again, that's a very Kathy O'Brien type situation. And I said that somewhere in my video, I said that he comes out very much as a cross between, a James Bond story and Kathy O'Brien. You just put those 2 stories together and we're talking Robert Merritt's story. But I do think it's very significant. And he was interrogated by Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor for the Watergate hearings, and Cox's people did all that, and right afterwards, Cox was fired. So all that information, boom. But he showed up and
on the stand, wasn't it? Are you gay? And he said yes.
Yes, that's at the Senate Watergate committee. He takes an oath and he's going to give testimony, and they know that if they say, "Are you homosexual?" that he is going to, basically lose the credit. And there's a big gasp in the room when he answers the question, yes, and they say. Right. It's 1972. It's pre Freddie Mercury. You have to look at that one. But I do think it's important because when we look at that, that's how they were able to get him out of that situation. But then later he gets another opportunity, and his own lawyer says, you can't do this because they're going to basically use it against you. And then as time goes by, they actually, it gets very intimidating after the Watergate incident. Because
in FOIA documents, is that how?
Well, give me that one again.
Does his identity sort of come out when people start investigating and writing books about Watergate in FOIA documents? Yeah,
right here. This is '73. Okay, so that's him showing up as an informant. So they have this with the disclosure of Robert Merritt's role as an FBI and Metropolitan Police informant in D.C. Okay, so October 5th, 1973. Okay, so that's after the Watergate break-in, but before Nixon resigns. So that's I think that the earliest snapshot. But there's also an article that I'm trying to retrieve from the Wall Street Journal that puts Merritt in a column of Jack Anderson's, and Jack Anderson saying something to the point of his testimony was very important if it's not heard, et cetera, et cetera. So Jack Anderson was a major figure around this era, and he's one of the most well-known journalists of the period. So that will put another connecting dot on there. We do know that that article exists. Now, as we get later into the 70s, you know, I have these other articles. And as I find this little bit, actually, why don't you tell us what ended up happening there with Kathy O'Brien? How did she get away from doing this kind of work?
Well, I guess that her time was up. It was a bit like Logan's Run was a little bit of predictive programming for this project that she was in as a presidential model sex slave. So that's interesting too, because it was presidential. You know, her stuff was presidential a lot of the time. You know, she was dealing with Noriega for Reagan.
Right, exactly. That is fascinating too, because there was an age expiration limit, which is supposedly how Mark Phillips, who became her husband, heard about her and her case. That he heard, oh yeah, we have one of these.
Well, apparently the programming begins to break down around the age of, in the early 30s. And so they want to get rid of them, kill them by the age of 30 to be safe. But that's when all these childhood memories and all the fragmented personalities start to sort of come back together again.
Yes.
And that's part of why they want to get rid of them. You know, plus they have all these secrets. It's just a total liability, period. And he, what was it? He was involved in forgetting what it was, but he could tell he was a primatologist at the Xerxes Ape Center. That's part of, you know, where the CDC is, you know, in Atlanta, that university over there. I'm forgetting the name of it. So he was there, and he, with, you know, primate psychology or primate cognition or whatever, and he could identify, you know, he just thought she was a really trashy prostitute or something, the way they had her dressed up and stuff. And, you know, her totally dissociative state, he could see beyond the role, like, whoa, this person's not normal. Something's going on here. And then he began to understand what it was. And he got her out of there, and he whisked her away to Alaska with her daughter, who was, I think, like, I don't think, not even 5 years old at the time. And she slowly began to get.
That is remarkable. It really is remarkable.
Yeah.
She also told me something very interesting in our interview, switching to Kathy O'Brien here for a second. She told me that it was marijuana that broke up the MK Ultra programming, and that's why the heavy discouraging of that. And they couldn't actually quite figure out why. But that's kind of fascinating.
Well, that's the only drug. The other ones actually do keep you down and sort of stupid. Most of them, maybe not the total, the hallucinogenics, but pot, she said, broke down mind control programming. So that's why, one reason why they were so against it. I'm finding out things now. I have like 10,000 really amazing doctors on my list. Just such cool, amazing guys. And some of them are into, you know, CBD and the endocannabinoid system, and how basically your immune system and your various levels of your neurotransmitter, because actually your neurotransmitter system and your immune system, to actually think that these things are separate is ridiculous. They're completely one and the same. And so that's why, you know, sort of the way you think is going to have an impact on your health. You know, if you believe you're unhealthy, it'll help make you unhealthy for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question about it.
I'm not like a big person about the secret and the power of that positive thinking stuff, but because that's the fake part. If you really have a core belief about something that's real and not something that's based on denial and bogusness, it'll probably have a good sway on your physical body, you know, and the health anyway.
Absolutely.
It'll make, you know, all that.
Another shot of Merritt. That's March of 1977. And it's his whole story. He's giving his whole thing about how he spied for these different agencies like the FBI. And he was on the record here, and he was picking up a little bit of coverage. And again, he got into a situation where he had said too much, and they were like, get out of the picture. And I do feel that there's this pattern kind of from what I was picking up with Merritt, where when he tries to come out and say things, then he was blocked, and he just gets discouraged, and then he comes back, you know, bringing out the revelation. So I do feel like he wants the truth out. Now, the situation as it stands, what I'm going to do next week is have Douglas Caddy come on the Dark Journalist show, and I'm going to ask him about the status of these communications with the National Archives, the chief archivist there, and the setup about it. And if the conditions are accepted, then Caddy and I will set up that meeting ASAP.
That's really, there's a lot of ifs there, but I can't wait to see this happen.
I think this is the thing. We are on the cusp of a gigantic story. I think Merritt coming forward is a breakthrough. It's the kind of 2018 breakthrough. And this is the thing that we really need to get behind. My feeling is that this story, you know, spread the story, spread the link, spread the information about the time capsule, because it's something that the public can help with here a lot. You know, we need something.
Sort of spam the archives to act on this.
Yeah, I mean, they should contact them respectfully and say this would be a good idea. Yeah, and you know, respecting their position too, because we're coming out of the blue at this. But here's the interesting thing that has to be kept in mind: National Archives knows Merritt and knows Caddy very well, because a series of documents about both of them were added in the last decade to the archives that came out of the records and FOIA requests, etc. Now we have a whole different ballgame, because this is not an unknown person showing up to the archives with a wild claim. It's somebody that they know has that background. So I think that helps the chances of the archives doing it. And look, it's in the archives' interest. The archives can have the document. There's no question about that. They're just saying, we'll point you to it, but you have to read it to the public. Now, let's be realistic. These different agencies around it are not going to want to get that information out. So there are a number of different scenarios. I agree with you. But nonetheless, I think our focus should be around the time capsule, because
no, you're not aware of any potential other scenarios.
I mean, hypothetically, you can imagine that they would have alternate scenarios, but my own feeling is, once the cat's out of the bag, then yeah. I mean, you know, you understand that we are people who went through the entire JFK document dump, and we were expecting all the records on October 26th. We shot an HBO special for that on that day. The live track of when we were getting that information, we did a live video right there, right from the studio. And what happened? They blocked the records at the last minute. Now, we got a rolling release, and there were some good things that came out of that. But these are very sensitive issues. The UFO file, if this time capsule really points to it, you know, I mean, the story is so off the charts, because Nixon had the information. If Nixon assigned someone from the Huston plan to do these different jobs for him, and he trusted him enough to tell him this, or even to show off at a certain point. But he also, in my opinion, he was building a human time capsule in Merritt in case the actual time capsule wasn't there, or if something happened to it. Now, here's another thing about it. The same letter was taped to Merritt's stomach in a package. And that's in the video. The entire story is there, and I would refer you to that. But the package was taped to his stomach, and he was supposed to deliver it to Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger has the letter. Okay. It was confirmed. It was confirmed that he got it. Yes.
Or that Nancy, his wife at the time.
Yeah, that's right. Nancy was the one who confirmed it. That's correct. You know, so they contacted Merritt later and told him this. So this is important if you think about it, because Kissinger isn't the kind of guy who would come out with this. But very interestingly, former leader of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev, came out and gave a press event, and it was with Charlie Rose before the big sex scandal. And he was sitting there with George Shultz, who, by the way, is 97. Okay, talk about the age extension technology. But Shultz was a big player for the Reagan administration as a Secretary of State and handled the whole situation between Reagan and Gorbachev and them reducing the number of nuclear warheads, which was historic. And, the Soviet Union fell a year later, but it has to be remembered that those nukes were just growing and growing and growing. And that was one of the first agreements since détente that Nixon had worked out, which actually reduced the number of nuclear arms. It's absolutely historic. But Gorbachev is sitting there, and in the middle of recalling these meetings with Reagan, he says, at Reykjavik, which was the most significant one, even though nothing came out of it, but they had decided there that it was the most significant turning point. Reagan said, let's go talk alone without our entourage. And that Reagan took him and said, look, if we face an alien invasion, will you help us? And he was absolutely dead serious. And Gorbachev said, yes, of course, I'll help you. And he was shocked by the question. And then Reagan said, we'll help you too. Now, this is particularly significant because Henry Kissinger was in the audience. And if you get a flash of Kissinger's face, I put this in my SSP and COG, Secret Space Program Continuity
video. That's right. It's crazy.
Yes.
I've run it. Yeah.
You ran it, yes. The Secret Space Program and Continuity of Government is the name of the video. And that's Gorbachev saying at a high-level summit with Reagan about the nuclear issue. Reagan wants to talk alien invasion with him. And we know all the speeches that Reagan gave at the UN about the alien presence and saying, I wonder really if there was an alien threat from outside this world, if we wouldn't all get together. And this, they say a lot of Star Wars, the SDI program, was related to this. But it is interesting that Kissinger was there in that little room because, and let me tell you, his face just, he looks like he's going to implode on the spot. Like,
because Kissinger's job is strategy of tension, is to keep the wars going. That's Kissinger's whole reason for being. So he doesn't like everybody getting palsy-walsy with the Ruskies. It's like the last thing he wants.
Yes.
And the last anybody who's associated with the Council on Foreign Relations wants.
Oh my God, no, they're kings of, there's two different types of secrecy.
And in every big, mainstream news agency.
I mean, you can't get any truth about it. And this New York Times example on December 16th was the worst yet. Okay, so we have some questions now. Olivia, how are we doing on questions?
It is such an intelligent chat tonight.
We have some great people out there, I have seen. And this conversation really is for you guys. I want to catch everyone up on the developments of this incredible video and this time capsule.
To notice also, is really his amazement of, the things that Nixon told him about this technology and how it was so beyond imagination, how high-tech and how advanced this stuff was, and it made Star Trek look antiquated. And he says, I can't wrap my head around this. I don't really understand any of this. This is some crazy talk to him. You have to understand that we've had 50 years of acclimatization through science fiction, through Star Trek, through, all these, Terminator, whatever, these movies. Back then, all they had so far was like Buck Rogers and whatever, Ming. What was it? The evil Ming or whatever that was.
Right, exactly. It was horrible. I mean, the thing was, there were, in the 60s, there were incredible sightings, just waves of sightings. I mean, even the Mothman thing in West Virginia with all the UFO sightings that accompanied that, it was practically like an invasion. There were so many sightings in Michigan in the way of 1966 that Congressman Ford, who'd already appeared on the Warren Commission, said, we have to look and make a congressional issue out of the UFO thing. The UFO thing was really in people's consciousness, Betty and Barney Hill, etc. And they just didn't know how to deal with it. I mean, they figured out that they would just whitewash and stall, and that's what they did.
These really bad B movies and just make it a joke and make it the National Enquirer and Weekly World News and all this stuff, so that really now everyone just thinks it's a big joke.
Yes, absolutely. And they've set up the mentality that way. it's a major problem because as we move into this era and the era that we're in, we're moving into something which is absolutely, we're going to get this kind of reality. People are going to know about the alien presence. We're moving into space. They can't avoid it. What are they going to do? Have people in denial that there are saucers whizzing by their windows when they're doing space tourism? There's no way around it. Now, one thing I want to point out is that, I'll see if I have it here. It is, well, I can refer to it. It's one of the Solaria reports dealing with space. And this was fascinating. It was from it was from January 2016, 2 years ago. That thing was so advanced that Catherine Austin Fitts, the former Assistant HUD Secretary, put together that I still refer to it, and it's still ahead of the headlines. But she's got space tourism, space mining. She examines the entire space economy, and she's working on another report about the space economy as we speak. But this is what's happening, and this is an aspect of it. But the people that have held onto the technology, that have held onto the awareness of the UFO file, of these off-world civilizations, and the technology involved with it, have kept the secrecy so tight, and have employed the blackest operations that they can't come clean. And this is part of the problem. We discussed this with Grant Cameron, who I think addressed it nicely, which is they are so knee-deep that the only thing that they could think to do, one aspect of that group, was to come forward and pretend that the UFO thing just started on December 16th and putting up, compromised video footage and all that. That was one attempt. And really, let's face it, that was blown out of the water. I don't think that, the ATIP thing has any validity.
No, I was almost trying to dial back to before the footage of the fleet of UFOs flying over the
right.
Capitol.
How many different UFO sighting stories could we tell here? There's so many. There's waves of them. And to treat this thing in a vacuum, like, hey, we've got UFOs, and Leslie Kane's book is going to be made into a movie. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's like they're victims of their own secrecy. They don't know what they can't keep their lies straight.
It is. And I would say this, that there are people who work in the UFO field that I respect, who have been going along with the nonsense around the Academy to the Stars. And it's time for them to say, look, we don't want CIA disclosure. We don't want to whitewash. I'm not going to play your game. You're not going to pretend that there's some evil tech out there, but not attribute it to an alien. You're just going to say, oh, it's an evil tech thing. That way people will be able to deal with it, and we'll get all this money,
Don't ask, don't tell space.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You hit it right on the head. I should call this whole episode that. But you can clearly see it. This is the situation that we're in. And it was a pathetic attempt. I mean, maybe they raised some money and, they try to do the whitewash, and some people bought it. But let's face it, the majority of people knew there was something up. And now we find out that it was a party balloon that they used instead of the UFO for the picture during the presentation. I mean, the credibility factor with
all plausible deniability built in, like, oops.
Yes.
It wasn't real. It was a mistake. Oops. It's like, what? No.
Yeah. Well, here's
you guys have your act together. That's not the way.
Here's two rules to adopt.
Yeah.
No billionaire involved, and no CIA involved. So no group of billionaires and no CIA involved in UFO disclosure. Okay.
That knocks everybody out except for maybe Grant. But
except for who?
Grant Cameron.
Grant Cameron, right? Exactly. No, I would far trust him with the issue way more. It is fascinating, though, isn't it? And that really, suddenly it was like, hey, look, there's another CIA guy. It's another intelligence asset. Oh my God, look, this guy has a big background. This guy still has a contractual relationship with the CIA. So we had a lot of that. That came up. Melinda Leslie had the interesting fortune to have lunch with Jim Semivan, and they did some videos that are very interesting with Grant Cameron and Melinda Leslie. And he basically, as far as I can see, he continued the whitewash in their conversation. And it was more of that. But, here's a guy who has an actual contractual relationship with the CIA now. Okay. I believe Elizondo does also, by the way. Walter Bosley set us straight on that one when he was here. And it's very easy to say, I left. But if you have a contractual relationship, they can still, pay your.
if any of Lawrence Rockefeller's money is still kicking around, or if that's all been spent.
Wow. Yeah. Now that is a really good point, and that would run you into
Stephen Greer,
yeah,
Mack,
John Mack.
Jacobs, Dr. Jacobs.
Yes, but I would say there was no grant like that around at the time. So Lawrence Rockefeller, I do feel when I
Black sheep, if he was the black sheep of the, the evil.
I think so. When you look into his past and stuff, it seems like he was somebody who wanted to bring the truth forward. The Clintons go visit him at his ranch, and they leave, and they have these books that say, is there alien life or whatever, and they're showing them so people can see it. So there was a real move there. It was going to happen, and
we talked about the witness story, Prince, what's his name, from Liechtenstein, and Paris de Cuellar from the UN, and they were going to do, and this was as a result of Gorbachev, and maybe Gorbachev having a hybrid son.
Yeah. Yes.
It's all pretty
right.
Nuts.
Yeah, that very, very unusual story, the Wendell Stevens story that he got from the Latin American reporter who was very well respected and went into that. That is interesting, but I think that we can look at one point of just taking a look at Gorbachev himself. He's in charge of the Soviet Union at the time. They know a lot about UFOs. They might have even known more than we did. We don't, we have some access to whistleblowers and stuff in our country. In the Soviet Union in those days, nobody could come forward and say they're keeping aliens. I mean, they just wipe them out. So we have no idea how advanced their program was.
Sure.
And I have a feeling it was pretty damn advanced.
I bet it was.
Yeah.
I bet it was. I mean, the UFOs fly over the whole planet, not just here. I mean,
I think it is important, though, because one of the things that this has brought up is that the culture has been force-fed this whole situation where they've been blocked around anything serious, but they've been given movies like Independence Day or Men in Black or some nonsense like that, and taken from real reports. By the way, if you go back to the books of Frank Edwards about Men in Black in the 60s, that's an absolutely real thing. And John Keel, of course, when he interviewed people and they would say, well, the Men in Black kind of look Asian, but not quite, he was really concerned about this. And he said, well, I'm going to put together a catalog of a bunch of different races and just lay it out for people. And over again, they stopped at Laplanders, who are that very unusual group of people, like deep in the Netherlands, and they do have kind of an Asian.
Finland, yeah, they have a slightly. Their linguistic group is Altaic. It's Asian. It's an Asian language. It's not part of the linguistic family of the languages of Europe. Of, the Romance and the Germanic languages that we speak.
Right. We have a couple of groups like that. You talk about the Basque a lot.
Another isolate. Yeah, they're very weird. The two are, well, at least see, Finnish and Hungarian are similar, and they can be traced back to the Altaic region of Western Siberia. Mm-hmm. But Basque is like, it's completely an isolate. They're very weird.
Really unusual. All right, it's Olivia's turn.
Okay, I'm going to go straight for the gusto. Squitch 5000 asks, is there anything about Merritt's story that bothers you as a journalist?
I talked upwards, backwards, and forwards, and sideways on the same questions, rephrased over and over again. And I found Merritt's story to be remarkably consistent. And when I looked for areas in the narrative that could be kind of pumped up or whatever it was, I didn't get anything like that. To give you an idea of what I got when I was speaking with Merritt, I got the impression of somebody who had something very big to say, who had a lot of anxiety about doing it, but a determination to get through the anxiety, and was also battling major health problems. So to answer your question, no.
I mean, from a viewer, I found he reminds me of Larry Nichols a little bit. He's got that voice and the accent, and that sort of has an effect of discrediting him as the things. And he keeps saying, I'm a ridge runner from West Virginia, and he keeps saying that over and over again. And like, he's
a real guy.
Oh, he is, but he's saying, basically, I guess his social status has discredited, he's been a discredited person his whole life, so he kind of sounds like one. That doesn't mean that he is one, because he isn't. All the documents and everything about him, I mean, he is a solid person. He did do what he said he did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that he's certainly been traumatized working with these people who used him as a really young man. And, this guy, 20 years old, putting him through this tasks. And I mean, what he told me is that when he was younger, he didn't have a conscience, but that he was coming to a conscience now. And I think coming from that situation in West Virginia where he was assaulted and abused by these Catholic priests set him up to be used by these other figures. And as we know, like with the Kathy O'Brien story, there's always a sexual element in there. It's like the MK Ultra aspect can work. You can program somebody. It's easier to give them instructions. It's easier to have them under your control if there's a sex aspect that's controlling that. And that's absolutely fascinating.
With the memory centers, but also just about your vulnerability too in that situation.
Can we even imagine what he had to go through? I mean, it's incredible. But then as a young man meeting Nixon too, and he was really nervous meeting Nixon, the way he described those meetings, and Nixon was like, hey, look, don't worry, you're doing this. It's for national security. And it's weird when he has such a great memory that when he's describing Nixon, you literally feel like you're in the room. I mean, it's incredible. But it wasn't just a story that I took on face value. I worked the story with him. I talked with him at length. I went into his background. I went into the background that he worked out with Douglas Caddy when Douglas Caddy had done a book with him. And, it's not a perfect symbiosis. They've had their own spats and things like that. That's public, that it's not like they're perfect partners or something like that. They certainly, they're just people who know that they have big information and need to bring it forward. And they're real people. I mean, Merritt, I just found very real and down to earth. But I did feel like there was an urgency and there was somebody who understood how important what he was saying. He knew it was important. And he said that I hope it's not too late. And my feeling was, you're just in time, it's just in time that you did this. And I think he was looking for an opportunity to do it. And that he
also said, I hope it's not too early.
Yeah, right. Too.
Because he doesn't know how much longer he wants to live having disclosed this stuff.
Well, I think if anything, he's a much safer person having disclosed it. This is the nature of the thing, because we know that when it comes to agency stuff, it's always, once somebody's out there, they don't want to make a martyr out of somebody. And if anything, I think all the good thoughts that people will have of Merritt and just being aware of him and his story and his undeniable background as an insider during that period will serve as a kind of a safety net for him.
I wonder if he might end up, surviving.
It would be wonderful. And I spoke to him about it. He told me how serious the situation is, and that they don't expect him to live very long. And I would say that there is something about him that you think, he's got an incredible iron will, and he's already survived. He's got more 9 lives than a cat. What have you got?
Okay, perfect follow-up question. Aaron White, does Daniel think the government would kill to keep the UFO secret?
They have. There's no question about it. But when you say the government, again, that's a pretty big block. We're talking about covert agencies that operate in the netherworld under and around and through these agencies. So, I'm not talking about Congress people and senators and things like that, although they might be in charge of appropriations of those committees. We're talking about deep state players who, particularly in the case of the UFO file, the Kennedy assassination is a fantastic point, but people have been harassed, and Betty Andreasen, her new book about the harassment at the hands of these black op agencies from the government, messing with their lives completely after her extensive sightings and coming out with that in the late 70s. They did not want that out. And, you start talking about the UFO aspects and you're a real experiencer, the black helicopters show up. That's not a paranoid fantasy. These things have happened to these people. And Andreassen's story in particular is very fascinating. And
Well, I had an interesting, I'm sorry, this is a real world. Like, I know a guy who's been a merc, is, you know, a contractor, and he has fellows in that business, and they're saying, hey, do you have a line on hybrids? You know, there's a great price for them. So, you know,
see that
there's a market price for them, and they're out looking for them to get paid.
right. Let's go outside the bounds of normal thinking for a moment. Yeah. And think of David Jacobs' work, which is all about hybrids being here. If an agency like that knew or was aware that there was a hybrid here, how valuable would that person be to have and to interrogate into?
Yeah, and in this case, it's right. It's about the whole culture, but it's also the specific. They're really looking for the telepathy gene. They want to get access to their DNA.
Oh, that's interesting. The telepathy gene. Yeah. I know we're going to have to do a show. We've been talking about doing a show around this. And I know that we're going to have to. The information that you got from this person that you're mentioning here, I think is very interesting.
Because it was exactly what David Jacobs said in his book. The people that he knows, the hybrids that he knows, totally live exactly that way. 3 to a house. They're totally awkward socially, but they're like brilliant engineering skills, just incredible technological skills, but just totally retarded socially. And,
we know.
Yeah. They almost look human. Their eyes are a little bit off. They wear contacts to cover the pupil is like vertical.
Right. And Alexandra, how many different cases have we had of people coming forward and saying, I was holding my hybrid baby aboard the ship? And, you know, how obsessed are the alien encounters with the reproductive sexual aspects of human beings? Obviously, there's some reason for that. And all these cases where the people say, well, you know, I was holding my child and it was half alien and it had like bad hair because it was an alien, but it had big human eyes, you know. So
reading the latest David Jacobs book, he goes in, you know, some of the, you know, there's one abductee who actually died. She died last year or the year before, and she was saying, I can't believe, you know, they're asking me to tell them how to go shopping at the deli, you know, the big part and order a sandwich or, you know, like they're still, it's like she was so bored. She was bored to tears with like just the stupid basic stuff. They can't tie their shoes. They don't know they don't know.
Well, there is this incredible development period that we as human beings go through.
And watching your parents and learning how to speak. Yeah. They have to learn how to speak with their mouths instead of telepathy, because that's the main way they speak. And then,
isn't all of this research, and you talked about the internet hitting a wall a couple months ago, and I agree with you. Isn't all this research leading us to, you know, it's time to move the culture. We have to acknowledge that these things are there, and even these backdoor attempts by people trying to make money off it, or the CIA trying to control it to create a Mandela effect that they're this great agency fighting demons or something. Even that is some kind of strange acknowledgement that the culture needs to move on this. And, you know, we really...
the rights of these people who are going to get kidnapped by private companies to get their DNA now, because, okay, that's like, we're talking about that's a private industrial abduction as opposed to like a military abduction.
Right. Well, let's think about this, and we'll tie this all around to our main theme here. But what do you think happens when one of these ships crash?
Well, I think that they get people out there immediately and try to recover everything that they can.
Okay, so we can look back over history and find stories like that. Kecksburg, you know, all these.
The first one I thought it was Kecksburg.
Yes, and they come and they.
A lot of people saw the flatbed. They were driving them on. Oh.
It's like, hey, you're taking away this acorn with hieroglyphs all over it. Like, it's a little bit strange, you know. That doesn't look like a space junk, you know. So what do? They take it back and they study it, right? And they get things from it. And it's not Bigelow Aerospace that's doing it. You know, they know where to study this stuff. and what we referred to as Area 51, and I'm sure they moved a lot of that out of Groom Lake at this point. But truly, they have a program for examining these things and figuring out the technology that's behind them and the groups. Now, I'm not saying that they know. I think that their knowledge has big gaps in it, but their knowledge is so vast. And this is one thing that Nixon told Merritt. The things that we have would make Star Trek antiquated. Our knowledge is so vast because of our communication with this alien, and that the scientists learned to communicate with, and the formula that he showed him. Now, the reason I asked about the crash retrievals is this. So that's what would happen. So that's how we get into the level of secrecy right off the bat. It's not an open society if there's a crash of a thing and then we can't see what it is, and they just drag it away and they won't tell us where it comes from, but they study it and they get all the benefits from it and roll it out through private industry or whatever. One of the things that Stanton Friedman told me is that the technology that they used to make boom boxes in the 80s came from one of these crash retrievals. And we have the incredible, Corso things about how things went from, working in the UFO lab into private industry and seeing how they could get it out there. And maybe, he attributed all these things to it. You can believe him or not believe him, like Kevlar and all the rest. But certainly there's something to him. Corso was in all these important places. He's the one who went on record and said, well, look, I briefed RFK and JFK. And you know what? There are records of him in communication with JFK and RFK. So I believe it. That's not a stretch. The thing that's
not that different from other declassified things I've seen about microwave anti-gravitics. Just the way that they, it's a thing that exists. It's real. It was developed in the 1920s by Townsend Brown and developed more since then. And they were floating it out to the biggest aerospace, commercial airliner builders, from like Boeing, and there was one in the UK, I'm forgetting the name. And this was in 1956, and they were really looking at replacing the jet engine at that point in 1956, just to give you an idea of how retarded our technology has been held back for, since we could have been using different propulsion decades and decades ago.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you think about it. Olivia, you're up.
Okay, so Verum Qui Bono. So how is Merritt so certain it's still in the White House? Can he see it during broadcasts, etc.?
This is a great question. I also wondered about this myself, and all I can tell you is he gave me a very firm yes that it's still there. And he did say it was hidden in plain sight. He did say it was in the White House, and he did also say, well, there was kind of a knowing, it's not a laugh, but it was, he had kind of there was this tone to the way he responded to me on it that he absolutely knows or believes it's still there. Now, certainly, I would say that it could have been discovered, it could have been taken out. He doesn't seem to think that that's true, and he is, after all, the person who's giving us the information. Okay, you're up.
Joseph Correa. Based on Merritt's info, are the beings literal extraterrestrials?
Yes. Now, he did not say that. This is an interesting part, and I would highly suggest that you watch the video interview. There's more to come, but he said that they came from outer space, another system, and then Nixon said that the being that they had, and that's what he referred to him as, a being. He didn't say an ET, he didn't say an alien. He also made a really good point to say, we don't have it in captivity, it's under our protection. This was absolutely important.
He also said it could have been from another universe. They didn't know.
But he did say it was from Planet X, which I found fascinating, because this is an unusual term.
It was used a lot, actually. And remember, there in the 1930s, they were Marvel. There was a Planet Marvel comic books, and I remember seeing cartoons from the 30s and 40s that had Planet X constantly.
Well, recently, there was Science Digest did an article on Planet X like a year and a half ago, and they said we may have discovered something on the edge of our system, and everyone was like, "It's Nibiru," So there is this.
Nibiru was Planet X at one time. And then
Nibiru, yeah, they merged the concept. Now, I went into this a little bit because Nibiru came up in the 70s. Sitchin's book, actually dealing with it, came out in 76. Even though it became popular in the 90s, that main book came out in 76, where he merged this Planet X idea with Nibiru. But he really was talking about Nibiru, and later they merged the Planet X idea because it does sound like the same thing. Now,
because what it could be is more like a dwarf twin of our sun.
yes,
with a weirdly elliptical, highly elliptical orbit, and they call that Nemesis. A lot of the theorists, I'm forgetting. There's a bunch of guys from the 80s who came up with that.
that's right. That's
and,
right.
It was called the Shiva hypothesis, and it was based on cycles of fossil diversity, and just showing how there's something on a very regular basis that's perturbing the orbit of comets that causes very regular extinction cycles.
Right, right, absolutely. And that's absolutely fascinating, by the way. I mean, one of the things we could look at and say, was he using the term Planet X as a kind of catch-all for another planet that was out there?
It's just to not go there, you know what I mean? Because planet can be used that way.
Yeah. But clearly, he did say that it was clearly from outer space, and he said that they came here. And at one point, he started talking about ancient aliens, saying that, you know, they'd been here earlier, and he pulled a book, an Egyptian book off the shelf, and he was showing him, Merritt, this. I mean, this is how deep Nixon was talking about this. He felt that it was incredibly significant to humanity. And, you know, the language that Merritt used when describing Nixon doing this, I found very, very telling.
Yeah, that's because he's not a UFO buff, and he doesn't really know about it. So it's interesting.
I really think that he is a human time capsule for Nixon. It's like Nixon was doubling down. He wanted this insurance policy, and his Huston plan employee, who could never say anything, you know, at the time, was the perfect person to do it. Okay, Olivia, you're
okay. Best question. Maura Coffey. Why did Merritt ask Nixon if it was those beings that started the whole Area 51 thing? Was Area 51 of common knowledge back then?
No, and what he said was in New Mexico or Nevada, and now they call that Area 51 since Lazar's thing, but he was referring to it because remember, in 1958, Dorothy Kilgallen was writing stories about how we were keeping aliens in storage at a facility and that it was floated out there. And supposedly she had got these stories from Marilyn Monroe, who had got them from President Kennedy during Pillow Talk. And, you know, so that whole relationship of facts, there was this idea that they were keeping aliens and that it wasn't the breakthrough story of Lazar in the early 90s, but it was certainly out there. And, so he was saying to him, you know, they keep them in these facilities. So Area 51 came into popular parlance in the early 90s, but the term itself had been around for a long, long time because, of course, they had Area 51. It was Eisenhower who started it as part of the continuity of government program, which was we're going to survive in the event of a nuclear holocaust. We will build all these underground facilities, and this facility was designated by Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon for the study of these ET crash retrievals.
This base in Area 51 in Tonopah in Nevada is an extension. It was like the budget or whatever came from, it was an extension of, what's that NASA field in California where everything comes?
Yes.
The space shuttle used to go there.
Yes.
What's the name of that place? I'm spacing, I can't.
I'm not there. But I know what you're talking about, yes.
Everyone's heard the name of this base a million times. That's basically where the budget and where Area 51, the money, the initial financing and the initial, you know, build of Area 51 came from that budget, from that base.
Right. And we know that when they had those crash retrievals in 47, you know, right off the bat, they had to figure this out immediately. Where do we bring this stuff? Where do we study it? Who do we let into the program? And a lot of those programs have come forward and said some of our best scientists, like Oppenheimer, worked on them. Makes sense to me. That's who you'd call in. You know, and so one of the interesting people that Nixon mentioned in that meeting with Merritt was the man who created the neutron bomb. And he was the only scientist, from what I can tell, that Nixon actually mentioned to Merritt. So, but I did find him very significant, and I've been looking into the history of this particular individual with Nixon. So maybe that will yield something. But it is fascinating because Nixon was saying, look, the scientists at Los Alamos have been working with this alien. They've had him for over 20 years. So that's a lot of material that they were able to do it. But whenever he spoke about it, see, the atmosphere was very gloomy because he had just discovered the Watergate break-in was going to take his presidency down. The only time he would cheer up, and according to Merritt, is when he got this kind of glint in his eye about this idea of the time capsule and the alien disclosure. And maybe he was thinking, this will make me great even if they take me down. So he was the key point man inside the government in the 50s for the UFO file. It makes sense to me. Okay, what else you got?
Okay, is this the J-Rod thing?
You know, that's fascinating. J-Rod is that scientist that was identified by whistleblowers saying that we were working with a gray scientist at Area 51, and it has some overtones like that. But I'll tell you, if you said J-Rod to Merritt, he wouldn't know what you were talking about because it's not. He's really not into the alien subject at all. So I do feel that it is a correlation there, though, because obviously at some point, if we learn to communicate with the ETs that were here or that we had found or come across, you have to start to wonder about that program. And it's another show, of course, but what levels do those interactions occur on? Is this individual being still with us? I mean, their lifespan might be much longer. The same one he's referring to might still be with us. I think the time capsule is important because it could give us a frame of reference for the whole deep state project around this. I don't think it's going to be easy information to get at. I think it's highly sensitive, but I think since it's out there, it makes it a little bit easier for them to acknowledge it. Maybe they won't acknowledge the alien aspect of the time capsule, but they could acknowledge the time capsule. That's the first step, I would suppose. But the contents are the most important thing, obviously.
Jeff Schuler, any thoughts of Merritt taking a polygraph?
Alexandra.
I doubt it. I mean, he's almost on his deathbed at the moment. And I don't think he really cares, like, if you believe. The document, it's either going to be there or it's not, basically.
I think that, yeah, I mean, the answer really is the location that he's provided for the document. If he's willing to provide it, they should be willing to read it, and that would clear it up if it's there or not. It's very simple. My own impression from talking with Merritt was not that he was on some grand thing about please believe me, and it wasn't that kind of a situation. It was really, I'm doing this because I'm discharging my duty. And I think that he was doing it because he feels that President Nixon was really railroaded at Watergate, and he feels that Nixon was a great president, and that he feels that Nixon gave him a great key, in a sense, to save Nixon's name. Okay.
Carol Upstone, do you really believe if the National Archives got hold of Nixon's hidden letter, it would be revealed, especially in light of this faux disclosure? I really don't see that happening.
I have to sort of agree there.
I've seen a few of your comments on this, and I would say it's not outside the realm of extreme possibilities. And didn't they do that recently on one of these shows? I would put it this way. It's kind of a hard thing to resist on their part. So my feeling is they should want to know. And if they go to the location and it's not there, then, they won't care. But if they go to the location and it's there, there is the possibility that they could say, well, there's a national security issue with it. Boom, you can't see the letter. So there are these variations. And when I had a discussion with Caddy about this, and this will be in our episode next week, we discussed it. You know, it's a real possibility, but he felt that putting it out there, you know, he's saying to it, look, you can have the document. It is there. We will show you the location. And it's in the White House. So why not, you know, without a big press hubbub about it, do it and open the letter. Now, this is not my, you know, it's not my letter, but the thing is, I can envision them responding and saying, okay, we'll do it. But if there are things that are sensitive to national security, then they're going to have to be redacted. So we'll need a representative from an agency to do that. That would be how I would see it coming about. So there's a little.
Merritt is really doing the right thing. He's not like going to the press with it or, you know, going to Roger Stone. You know what I'm saying?
True.
Surrendering it to a federal agency. He's being a good doggy about the whole thing.
Right. He's saying, look, I want the government to have this document. I do think it's important when we go back. I'm going to go back to this letter momentarily, and what I think are the significant moments. And we're going to take about 5 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up. It's great to have everyone here, by the way. I've seen some fantastic people and fantastic questions. Najat Madri is there. She's asked a question, Olivia. Can you catch her question?
Well, actually, I kind of had something in mind.
Okay.
There's a whole bunch I want to ask,
Okay.
basically because they're all related,
Yes.
and I think they're really important to get to. So
go ahead. You're up.
Coffee says, can anyone else back up Merritt's claims? And then Matt Lacasse asked a bunch of questions. I want some evidence this CIA asset who had the letter taped to his stomach is who he says he is and really is telling the truth. Are there any other people who can back up or substantiate Merritt's story? Why do you think he taped the package to Merritt's stomach? Why not just give him a briefcase? Also, how many years was Merritt's tenure? And then there were a lot of questions about Kissinger. And have you approached Kissinger? What would Kissinger do with this information? And why would Nixon trust Kissinger? So that's a whole bunch of things that are all
Nixon,
related.
according to Merritt, Nixon trusted Kissinger above all else. And, you know, many people would say that because Nixon brought Kissinger to prominence. He created a role that didn't exist to put him in the government. Because originally, Henry Kissinger was not the Secretary of State. Nixon created a whole new program for this national security advisor. And, you know, I mean, they were tight. They were incredibly tight. Who is Merritt, who he says he is? Yes, I just went through. I mean, have you been watching the show? I just went through 40 years of his history. I've shown you newspapers from the 1970s. If you watch the video, you'll get even more info. So yes.
Was he employed? No. I mean, he was used in black bag operations. He was a gay prostitute who was compromising politicians so that they could be blackmailed. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I mean, this is these are the deep operators that we have.
You know, he is, you know, the nature of his thing, it's so embarrassing or whatever, you just don't even want to, you know, deal with it.
But what's amazing is this. For someone who was in such a black op kind of situation where they were giving him tasks and doing surveillance and getting blackmail and sex blackmail to use against these individuals, there's actually a really incredible paper trail for this guy, unlike other people who come out as a whistleblower around these things. This guy actually has an incredible paper trail that we've been showing here. So for sure, absolutely. The evidence for the time capsule is him giving them the location and them opening it. There is no other way to get evidence for that. How else can you get evidence about a secret time capsule that Nixon placed there, except by taking the instructions of how to find it from the person who knows where it is? So that explains itself. But I would say in terms of Kissinger and the covert ways that they would do this, look, if you have something important to get to an individual and you're the president and you're under siege during Watergate and they're watching your every move, then what you will do is use your completely undercover Huston plan operative who is outside. There's no fingerprints on him. You won't send over, you know, Haldeman or somebody like that. You're not going to send your attorney general to Henry Kissinger to give them this secret message. You are going to use somebody who they can't track. And that's
the profile, the most unlikely person.
Yeah, right. And so, what he said to me, he does not make this big role for himself. He said, Kissinger was the person that Nixon trusted. I was just a courier for President Nixon, a trusted courier. That's really what he's saying there. It's true. There are some claims that he made that Nixon said to him, you're better than some of our best FBI guys. But Nixon was known to, kind of cajole and work with people that he liked. And the language sounded very consistent to me. I think what's fascinating, what we have to get our heads wrapped around here, is that we're already kind of past a point with this story. Like the story of his meetings is out. He already has the background to show. We've already shown the background. He's already out there as a public figure. He wrote a book in 2011 called Watergate Exposed. All the people who are in deep state research and historical research around Watergate, or things like the JFK assassination, know these levels exist of these types of operators. And certainly people that are familiar with the Watergate story are familiar with Merritt. Look, I read a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist from the New York Times giving a character reference and he's worked with Merritt for years. I mean, what more could you want from a whistleblower? Do you want a signed note from President Nixon saying, hey, I told this guy that I hid a time capsule? It might be in there. I mean, the fact is, the way to solve the question around is the time capsule there is to go there and open it. And I think those reasonable steps are being taken care of. And I hope they answer in the affirmative, because I think there could be some openness there with the Trump administration to something like this. I think that they want some kind of exemption around national security, but I think it's important, if there are these false disclosure efforts coming out of these agencies, and the CIA one that we saw in combination with the New York Times, maybe the Trump administration would be interested in saying, look, something real is here. Trump administration opened the Space Council. They said we're sending people back to the moon and that we're going to Mars. I mean, there is a lot of interest. And, when they came out and they started doing these things around this UFO deal with the CIA, what did Trump do? He announced an audit of the Department of Defense. So this is somebody who I feel is really clued in on a number of subjects, and he wants some of that space power. That's why, he wanted to develop the Space Corps, and the Space Corps would have to answer the Air Force would have to answer the Space Corps, not the other way around. That's very important change, I think. So we're looking at an opportunity there. I think it should be tried, and that's what we're doing. And I'm hoping to get more information from the archivist. I hope the archivist responds by next week, so that when I talk next week with Caddy, we'll have more for you on that.
Okay, CC Jarvis. Nixon ran NASA from its start. VP duties, any correlation of prior knowledge of Ebens during presidency? Nixon was exposed to NASA. He was their boss.
Yep.
Did they get to him, or was that why he resigned?
Oh, that's an interesting angle. Well, I mean, you've said that as Eisenhower's VP, he was exposed to.
Yes, no question about it. But he was very close to the whole paperclip thing. And someone mentioned Mae Brussell earlier. There's a fantastic Mae Brussell presentation called President Richard Nixon and Paperclip, which gives you all of those connections of the post-war Nazi international scientists working in our space program closely with Nixon. Nixon expected to be the guy who announced we were going to the moon because he thought he was going to be president in 60, but he did wind up being the president when we landed on the moon. So he kind of got in through the back door there. But there's no question about it. He had incredible knowledge around the UFO secrecy. He was very close to the UFO file, and he was the one, according to the whistleblower, who delivered the threat from Eisenhower that said, when the CIA wouldn't give him reports on the alien updates, said, I'm going to take an army unit and go into Area 51 and get what I want. That sounds like Eisenhower to me. And that whistleblower is named Cooper, Kewper. his testimony plays a large role if you want to find out about Nixon and the ET factor, and those are in Earth Files, Linda Moulton Howe's reports. Absolutely stunning information.
You know, and what's interesting is that how little Nixon is associated with the whole UFO ET thing. Like zero on him. Like I said, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Reagan, Truman. You know, even Bill Clinton to a certain degree. You know, Carter talked about, you did a Playboy, wasn't it a Playboy interview or something? So,
yes, he said he lusted in his heart, but that he'd never committed
UFOs. I mean, and so, you know, I think that's also on purpose. You know,
I want to thank President Carter, actually, because President Carter really boosted up our ability to get FOIA documents, and he was incredibly open about the UFO subject, and he tried to get those records and that information. So I want to thank President Carter for that. What's up, Olivia?
Aaron White asks, does Daniel think Marilyn Monroe's pillow talk with JFK got her killed?
I think her association with the Kennedys was seen as a threat by deep state operators. And strangely enough, the research that I've followed around this is that she was killed with a suppository, which is something that these deep operators do, actually. And it is quite likely that that's how she was eliminated. There's no question her death has always been very suspicious. And I do think that there's room there because Kilgallen, Kennedy, and Marilyn Monroe were all very tuned in to this alien aspect. Kilgallen was following it almost before anybody. So, you know, what do they do with the people in that era who are following the UFO thing? We'll just ask Morris Jessup, who committed suicide out of the blue. No, they knew how to keep the hardcore knowledge secret. No question about it. What else you got?
Fun question. Could this be what's on the 18-minute gap?
This is an incredible, famous 18-minute gap. And I actually watched, if you watch Nixon's interview with David Frost after Watergate, he gets very nervous when they talk about the 18-minute gap. And it's always been strange because he let all of his tapes out with all the swears and everything that went on and, you know, all that inside information. And he wound up not fighting to keep the tapes secret, which is amazing for a lawyer to do because the tapes were his. But he let them out. And what happened that I think was very interesting is that this conversation that he was having is the same person who said that when he referred to the Bay of Pigs, he was referring to the JFK assassination. So he certainly could have let something out there about the UFO file. And if he had, that could not be let out into the public. Absolutely not. But if he had mentioned the time capsule, bang, absolutely. He would definitely delete that. My feeling is, and again, this is not from Merritt, this part. And I should say, on the record, Merritt has never said anything to anyone about the 3 meetings or the UFO aspect, the alien aspect of his conversation with Nixon. That's all new. That's not in the public record. He's talked about Watergate before, but that's never been out. And, you know, so I hope that answers that question. It's kind of fascinating.
Scotty asks, does Daniel know what Jimmy Carter was told about aliens that made him cry?
This is a weird story. What we do know for a fact is that Carter, when he got into office, wanted the information from then CIA Director George Bush Sr., who became vice president and then president. And that Bush said, you don't have a need to know, so don't ask me for that. And that Carter fired him outright. And that tells you a lot about that relationship.
Was he out of the CIA then? Bush
was, yeah.
Wow. So he fired him from the CIA. That's amazing.
Yeah, he was the director. Well, and
a rough time for the rest.
Definitely. I mean, I don't know why it wasn't made a bigger deal of that Bush was CIA director when he was placed on the Reagan ticket, and then he took it. They didn't really ever talk about his background, and I always found that suspicious. As we know, when Reagan had the assassination attempt, John Hinckley Jr., who shot him, who's free now, by the way.
Oh, wow.
But he shot him.
Friends with the Bush family.
Absolutely. He was, as a matter of fact, it was in Neil Bush's basically date book that he was going to have dinner with him the next night. So that family was major, the Hinckley family. They were major Republican donors, etc. And it's the weirdest story. And if you go back, you can see some reports, even in Time magazine, referencing the fact that, oh, well, Hinckley may have known the Bushes, by the way. And his family was associated with him. So, you know, it's pretty unusual. The Jodie Foster thing reminded me of the Mark David Chapman thing. It's like Catcher in the Rye and then Jodie Foster. It's
they
like
look alike. They have the same features,
yes.
The same body type. They almost look like twins.
Let me tell you about assassinations during that period. There was an assassination attempt on the Pope. Anwar Sadat got assassinated in Egypt. President Reagan was part of that wave, barely survived. We would have had Bush in there much earlier.
Yeah, right.
And they say that after the assassination, it was much harder for Reagan to function. Attempt. There was another piece of that. I'm sorry. What was the end of that, Olivia?
I heard that actually Nancy was doing the work.
I bet she could. She was very capable.
It was what was Jimmy Carter told that made him cry?
Oh, yeah, the cry part. Thank you. Well, this is interesting because it's disputed, but I will say this, that I know that Shirley MacLaine's story is that Carter, after he left office, said, I want you to come and meet with me. And she showed up there and he said, what are the aliens doing here? What's the deal? And she said, they're going to show us that war is foolish because no matter how many times you put someone on a battlefield and kill them, they will reincarnate. And when she started talking about reincarnation, he got upset again and said, I'm a Christian, I can't accept it. But he seemed very disturbed about this UFO thing. He does talk openly. I've had people have approached him. He talks openly about having seen a UFO, and he also talks openly about, you know, the impact that it had on him and him trying to get records, and he couldn't really do it. He'll be open about that. And interesting little tidbit is that Stanton Friedman told me that at Logan Airport, he bumped into Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter recognized him and engaged him in a lengthy conversation. Yeah. So Carter's really.
Oh, I guess now he'd be in an airport. Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Olivia, you're up. And we'll take a few more questions and we'll wrap it up. It has been fantastic being with everyone. And the story is rolling forward. I want us to get the story of the time capsule and Merritt's story about the 3 meetings beneath the White House out there because I think it's important to history. And I think this process with the National Archives, we can be kind of cautiously optimistic about it at this point. Okay, what else?
Everybody wants to know how Merritt found you.
Oh, that's easy. Merritt had worked previously with Douglas Caddy on a book, and Douglas Caddy's interviews where he came forward talking about E. Howard Hunt, who was his best friend, and he came forward on my show and said that Hunt had told him that JFK was assassinated over the alien presence because he was about to give that secret away by sharing it with the Soviet Union at the time. And so Merritt said that he had profiled me. My guess was, you know, he was looking for someone to share this information with, but certainly it's the association with Caddy that brought him forward to work with me on this story.
Okay. Scotty, again, does Daniel feel positive about our future?
I think cautiously optimistic is a good word again. There's no doubt that there are things that need to be addressed in society, and in the shows that I've done with Catherine Austin Fitts and Joseph Farrell really get to the core of this, which is you've got a wall of secrecy. You've got all this money disappearing into a black ops program dealing with space. And then you have all this secrecy around it, and then you have a corrupt political system looking over that. We have to move beyond that, and I do feel that the elements of realizing this aspect of the UFO factor is important because the culture can kind of grow and expand. You know, we're at a point where they have to stop dumbing us down and making a profit off of doing that. But instead, we have a small group who wants to do anything they can to make a larger margin and tighten control over, the population at large. And we hear a lot about depopulation aspects and things like chemtrails and that. I mean, the truth is, there's a lot of things that aren't in our control, but what is in our control is to be able to talk about the issues, because if you can break down the wall of secrecy, possibly people on that side of the fence can come forward, and it can be like, we're helping the good people that are inside the system as well. It's an excellent question, by the way. Great questions today. I mean, this is...
There's no trolls tonight.
That's great. It's troll-free. Somehow we managed it.
Okay, so this is an obvious question. Charlie UK, the White House has been completely renovated multiple times since Nixon resigned. The chances of anything remaining are slim.
Well, I would say that I addressed those very same points, but nonetheless, Merritt was very confident about it. So I'd have to say, there's too much speculation involved there. I will say this, that someone sent me pictures of Obama frantically in the last 2 months of administration, digging up in front of the White House with tractors. And no one could figure out what was going on there. So maybe it's just a coincidence, but hey. Najat asked a question up there, and I think it was something about Mac Tanis. And anytime we get an opportunity to talk about Mac Tanis, we should. Tanis was a very unusual researcher. We've talked extensively about him, but he never gets quite the light of day. His theory was simple, and he studied UFOs often, that there was another group of human beings who were a little bit advanced from us, and that they lived here side by side with us, and that they had better technology, but they weren't that much more advanced than us. And I do feel that his early death at 34, which was very unusual, is strange. And I think that people should look at his very interesting book. Najat, what was the name of his book? I have it here, but it's Cryptoterrestrials. Excellent book and very unusual. And whenever he speaks, he's a very logical kind of guy. And Catherine Austin Fitz is a fan, so he's up to something good. Do you want to say anything about Tanis, Alexandra?
I actually am not very versed in Tanis.
Okay.
Scotty, one more, please. Is he going to the Washington March in March? Tracy Beans is setting one up.
Tracy Beans, is a interesting YouTuber, and she's done a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, the Q stuff was around with her, and I think that effect around all that was weird, and all the people following Q. But she's a very nice person, and I think she does good work. But I may be going to Washington, but not for that march.
I'm giving Q a little more credibility these days. I'm having people tell me that it's
I'm telling you, it's. Do you want to? I read this with Olivia the other. I could get it. Right now.
I don't.
It said here it was. It was the worst kind of poetry. It was, bring light, be an army. You are light, and they are bad. And it was the worst. It was it's terrible. I mean, whatever the Q started off with, and I did a series of interviews with Joseph Farrell about it. And I know that there was something when those posts came up originally, but whoever hijacked the thread and runs those people around all over the place trying to find the white rabbit, no, that's not how we do research in alternative media. It's junk conspiracy. Let's get a quick look at dark journalism. There's the official story. There's the counter story. Counter story looks at the official stories and finds holes in it. Often you find very good researchers in that counter story. They call them conspiracy theorists. But under that is junk conspiracy. And the junk conspiracy ruminates and tries to ruin the counter story so that the official story is the thing that people rush back to because the other thing gets too crazy. So that's a fundamental. Whenever you look at any big story that's going out, try to find the official story, the counter story, which they call the conspiracy theory, and then the junk conspiracy. The JFK assassination is an easy one to do. The official story, Oswald fired the bullets alone just for the heck of it. Ridiculous story. Counter story, it was a conspiracy inside the government to remove the chief leader. Kennedy, who was making big changes. The junk conspiracy, the driver did it. Okay, that should give us good, easy layers. Okay, what you got next?
Everybody wants to know if you're going to go on Joe Rogan.
Yeah, Joe Rogan's a great guy. I mean, he let's not forget Tom DeLonge's infamous appearance on Joe Rogan. Didn't work out so well for him.
Are you scared?
I'll tell you, we'll do it together. That'd be an even better show. We'll have a lot of fun that way. But certainly, I would talk to Joe Rogan. He did an excellent interview with Graham Hancock. And I have an interview with Graham Hancock on the comet and the ancient history around what the comet changed. But, you know, that quality of show, I think, is something that we need. Okay. But yes, certainly I would be open to that.
Zora Dax, what does DJ think of the taped Elizondo Q&A at the UFO Congress this weekend?
Well, this is very interesting. Elizondo is a counterintelligence officer, and he has been involved in counterterrorism and in fighting FARC rebels, drug-running rebels in Colombia. It's an incredibly advanced CIA deep operator. Him showing up at the lowly UFO desk and then being disgruntled and saying, I'm going to let the truth out. No, I don't buy Elizondo's story at all. And I would invite him to come on this show because his story would collapse within 5 minutes of our discussion. So I don't know who they think is out here that's going to accept these ridiculous things that, oh yeah, I got videos, you know, Department of Defense didn't mind. Don't worry about it. It's ridiculous. So it's certainly a counterintelligence narrative. And anytime anyone from the TTSA shows up on the radar, all my red flags go up because it's a CIA operation. But I do find it interesting that at the Congress, Elizondo did not show up personally to answer questions, which is a different environment, but he staged answers in a different environment. And so he can do that, you know, like when he talks to George Knapp, it's like, here's the, you know, we're going to talk about these questions. And, you know, so it's his friend and it's easy chit chat. And then here's another thing where it's pre-taped, you know, so they're worried about having this guy out just running his mouth because he does weird things. Like when he was on CNN, he was like, well, it was secret, but it's not secret. Which is it? Counterintelligence CIA chief. And by the way, he reported to John Brennan, who is the drone king. And John Brennan's big claim to fame is that, you know, he used more drones than anybody when going after targets.
People who are not supposed to even be at war with. Right.
And by the way, John Brennan, shortly after this To the Stars thing, started to talk about UFOs and say we need to study that, you know. So this is a CIA operation and of the worst kind. What else you got?
We're kind of wrapping up here. This is, I mean, I don't want to open things
yes.
up in a crazy
No, it's good. We'll wind it down.
Okay, so Lee Beltman has 3 really interesting questions. Barry Seals and the Houston Project connected?
That is a really good question. Mm-hmm. There's no question that, and we will, that does open up a gigantic question. Yeah. Barry Seal was trained by the same unit that David Ferry was in charge of. David Ferry was the person who set up Oswald to be the insider intelligence guy that he was. So then Barry Seal became George Bush's main guy in the Iran-Contra deal.
Yeah,
and he was
very Houston-ish.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely agree. So great question.
Yeah.
There was a movie with Tom Cruise. They didn't go far enough with it. That was about Barry Seal, but it's worth a viewing.
Just
okay.
Recently, and it's kind of a comedy. They make it like, we're drugs.
Yeah, right.
Arms for hostages.
What the heck? Let's have a good time with George Bush running drugs.
Watergate and the Franklin cover-up seem to be connected.
Well, Franklin cover-up is associated with the Reagan period and the Republican administration, the people around the Republican administration in the 80s. But certainly one of the interesting things that Merritt told me is that one of the things they were trying to get in Watergate was not just a list of prostitutes that were being used, but also information around pedophilia that they could use against their political enemies. So it does tell you that that's been an ongoing problem since there have been power circles on Earth, and it is coming more to light now. But Kathy O'Brien, again, where we started on that.
Right, and now I think it's being used more in blackmail because being gay is no longer stigmatized like it used to.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, that's what Merritt was doing, was compromising guys by, you know, compromising them for being gay. It's not an issue anymore.
I will say this about Merritt, which is he did, you know, later say that he wouldn't reveal the names of a lot of those people because they had families, and that, you know, they were just these straight guys with families on the surface, but they had all these kinky gay fantasies. And so, but he didn't reveal who a lot of them were. And I guess that's to his credit. Okay. What else you got?
Okay. So behavior modification and the human potential movement with COINTELPRO should be looked into a little more.
Wow.
In my opinion.
Well, I mean, I've looked into that stuff. I spent like the early 2000s doing that. It's very much alive. It's not like it's in the past. It's alive and well. It's happening in front of our very eyes.
ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net. Do you want to research COINTELPRO? ForbiddenKnowledgeTV.net, DarkJournalist.com, Solari.com, GizaDeathStar.com. You got plenty of reading material. Professor Peter Dale Scott. But yes, fascinating. Okay, we'll take two more questions.
So this is probably around the last question. Rock and Root. It's no problem if you're winding up. My question is, Trump's connection to Tesla papers been seen by his granddad, I think. Yeah,
that's something that I go into with Joseph Farrell, and I think that's 2 episodes ago. But we have glanced on that, and there's no question that he had someone in the family who was very advanced around the Tesla aspect. I think in Trump, we're looking at somebody who knows a lot. Remember, Trump, in a public campaign, political campaign, mentioned a conspiracy around 9/11. He mentioned the vaccine link to autism. He mentioned oddities around the JFK assassination. This is not somebody who went into this process uninformed. He definitely has a lot of information. What else you got?
Everybody wants Joseph Farrell's take on this subject.
Absolutely. And I have spoken to Joseph, and he was pretty engaged this week, but we plan to do something on it maybe in the next week or 2. It's the story right now is there's a lot of material that's going to be coming up about it. So there's a new video next week with Caddy, and then after that, there's 2 more coming. There's more information coming to light around it, but certainly the most important thing is going to be the response of the National Archives to Douglas Caddy's letter. So thank you. Wow, incredible questions. I'm really blown away. Yeah, you got.
I guess it's
I'm
off
here.
topic, but it's a great. It's not even a question. He's just throwing it out there. So it's Jabberwocky. Used to have telepathic experiences rather often before Wi-Fi and 4G. Something changed around the time smartphones became ubiquitous. Anyone else? Alexandra, what do you think?
It makes a lot of sense to me. That's interesting. I hadn't connected those, but I think I have heard things sort of to that effect with other, not with the frequencies being used in cell phones, but prior, when it was just, you know, microwave from the 900, you know, just the cordless phones. I think there's something there. I think that it could impinge or, you know, put a like a block your own, you know, your own EM field from expanding.
We used to have people who would say that in relation to power lines that there were difficulties. Right. So now you're sleeping next to a power line with the smartphone.
When I lived in a block away from the World Trade Center, I lived in an area that was just swarming with radiation, and my 900, you know, hertz, or I think that's what they were, phones used to die every 3 months. And there was a superintendent in the building next door who was doing a ham radio, and it was right in my window. And I finally took a bag of dead phones and I threw them at his feet, and I was like, "You're going to pay me $600 right now. You're paying me $600 in cash, or you're going to get fired. I'm going to tell on you to your boss." And he gave me cash. There was some hard. New York.
This is Alexander playing hardball. I love that. That's a weird story, though.
Yeah, but I was like, you're killing me. You're giving me cancer, dick. You know, like pay me at least.
Here's the thing about Alexandra that everyone needs to know. Regarding the JFK assassination, close friend of JFK Jr., okay? Regarding the 9/11 whole thing, lived right at 9/11, too. Regarding the UFO thing, has something like a dozen UFO sightings?
More like two to 3 dozen.
Was regressed by John Mack. I mean, it's amazing the interesting places that you show up.
Yeah. Or Don Rumsfeld was my dad's boss for 5 years. I beat him. We came. I'm gonna scan that finally. I'm gonna open it up. It's like evaporating. It's so old. But
I want to see that. I definitely want to see that. The other thing is this story. You're right in the middle of this story because I came to you with it first, and because that's the kind of thing Forbidden Knowledge TV is like that to me. I want to know that when I'm talking to an outlet about it, when we're talking about things that you and I know, when we get a big story, that it's the kind of thing where the people involved are very important. That's the kind of thing I think that we should build in alternative media. That's why, the story is not proprietary, by the way. All the material is going to be out. All the researchers, all the people from any level of the alternative field on the UFO side, they can all use this material to bring the story out. And I hope that they do. I think that, it's not plagiarism if they credit the story to Merritt and his original interview with us. And but I really, it's not a proprietary story. I don't believe in like exclusive anything. Just, get the story out. It's important. Everyone needs to get on board with it. It's fabulous. We finally have a chance maybe to get our hands on something that was left by Nixon, who was the ultimate insider on the UFO file. Let's take a chance. It's a much better chance than some flyaway New York Times thing. This is something I think we can get behind. And I think that we should. My own impression from speaking to Merritt is that the story is absolutely real, and I think he has the track record to back it up. All right, last question.
Baron Quibono just says, please let them know this post-interview discussion is incredibly valuable.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Well, you guys have asked fantastic questions, and Alexandra was in incredible form tonight. We have an important story.
I did not sleep for 1 second last night, and I actually caught myself nodding off a couple of times in the beginning when you guys falling asleep on camera.
That simply won't do if you pass out, but it's okay. We'll wait for you to come back. The interesting thing is, I do think that that's the kind of thing that people need to know about you too, is when you're working on stuff, you work through. It's like a thing, you won't let it go till it's done, and then you'll fall asleep. And I'm a little bit like that, except I stay up really late, but I'll get to bed eventually. All right. Thank you, everyone. Olivia, outstanding questions. Thank you for that. Big round of applause for Olivia, because she really has kept the chat together with all the moderation. And David Ward, yes, David, thank you very much for your questions and your comments. I know you're a regular out there, and it's great to see everybody. It really is. So we will have more information next week. This is a powerful story. You can follow it at darkjournalist.com. Follow it on this YouTube channel. Tell people about the time capsule story. Tell them about Merritt. Direct them to the video. That's where his only testimony about these things is right now. And make sure we get the story out. It's crucial, and I think it could move the culture forward. We can get some really good answers on this, and it's something I think everyone can get behind. So let's give it a shot. It's great having you here, Alexandra, and amazing, amazing commentary.
Okay, thanks. Anytime, bro.
Great. And thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. Have a great weekend. Bye, Olivia.